Hello, everyone, and welcome to ESTAMOS BIEN La TRIENAL 2021, El Simposio. My name is Clara Diaz from el Museo del Barrio's Public Program Department. On behalf of el Museo del Barrio, welcome. Good evening. Before we start the program, we'd like to share some brief instructions to optimize your experience. Bienvenidas todos. Antes de comenzar el programa, les compartiremos unas breves instrucciones para optimizar su experiencia. We're happy to have with us today Colectivo Babilla, language justice workers who will provide live interpretation. They do language justice work through an anti-racist, trans-feminist, and anti-colonial lens, with a diasporic experience between New York and Puerto Rico. Es un placer presentar esta tarde al Colectivo Babilla, quienes hacen justicia y trabajo de interpretación a través de un lente antirracista, transfeminista y anticolonial, a raíz de una experiencia diaspórica entre Nueva York y Puerto Rico. This event will be in English with simultaneous interpretation in gender-inclusive Spanish. To listen to the interpretation, if you are on a computer, go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and select your language. Via smartphone app, click on the three dots that say More, click on it, and choose Language Interpretation. Choose Language and click Done. Este evento será en inglés, con interpretación simultánea en español, utilizando lenguaje inclusivo. Para utilizar la función de interpretación en la computadora, dale clic al globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y elige tu idioma. En el smartphone, clic más 3 puntitos y dale clic a la interpretación de idiomas. Escoge el lenguaje. No olvides darle clic a listo para que se active. If you have any other trouble or questions, feel free to reach out to Babilla on the chat, where they will have their names and the word interpreter in the description. Si tienen algún problema o duda, le pueden escribir a Babilla a través del chat, donde tendrán sus nombres y la palabra intérprete en la descripción. In addition, you may access a transcript of the program or select subtitles by clicking on the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen. If connecting from a phone, click on the three dots on the bottom right to select View Full Transcript option. Además, pueden accesar una transcripción del programa o subtítulos al seleccionar el botón que indica Live Transcript en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Si fuera desde un teléfono celular, haga clic en los 3 puntitos en la parte inferior para seleccionar View Full Transcript. And finally, we encourage questions for the panelists. To submit your questions, please click on the Q&A option on the lower part of your screen and simply enter your question there. Finalmente, les exhortamos a que envíen sus preguntas a los panelistas en el encasillado de Q&A localizado en la parte inferior izquierda. Muchas gracias por su atención and enjoy the program.
Boa tarde, buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Rodrigo Moura. I am the Chief Curator at El Museo del Barrio. Today I'm joining from São Paulo, Brazil, and I would like to acknowledge the indigenous traditional ownership of this land and the admirable resistance of the Guaranis of São Paulo, the Lenapes of Manhattan, where El Museo is, and all indigenous people worldwide against the perverse effects of colonialism throughout the centuries. On behalf of the museum and of co-curators Susanna Temkin and Elia Alba, who will be joining me today in this opening panel, I would like to welcome everyone to today's program, El Simposio, which officially opens the last weekend of ESTAMOS BIEN La TRIENAL 2021. Welcome, everybody. Initiated with a series of online projects in July 2020, and opening its doors last March as the first national survey of Latinx art organized by El Museo del Barrio, La TRIENAL brings together the works of 42 artists and collectives working across the United States and Puerto Rico. More than anything, the survey format was understood as a conversation platform. Going beyond the museum walls, we organized 12 online programs held over Zoom with participating artists and guest speakers, in addition to several live conversations and takeovers on social media over the 6 months of the exhibition. The same spirit of creating a dialogic platform shapes today's programs, when we'll have the opportunity to examine the exhibition one last time before it closes. Our participants this afternoon include Julie Rodriguez-Wildholm, Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, Elizabeth Ferrer, Marcela Guerrero, Ariana Curtis, Nugent Smith, Vic Quesada, and Vivian Crockett, divided in 2 panels, one around recent exhibition projects centered on Latinx art, and another one on notions of intersectionality informing the field. As well as we are joined by artist Candida Alvarez, who's presenting closing remarks this afternoon. A big thank you to all participants. Stay tuned for the next panels, and do use Zoom Q&A box to enter your questions and comments to the speakers. I would like to start the conversation by putting together a question for discussion between us, co-curators of the exhibitions, as we always thought of this conversation as some sort of a debrief. I've been saying we embrace the survey format, which is, I mean, sometimes a controversial format for museum curators, but as a sort of a revival of the S-Files, you know, a series of exhibitions organized by the museum over the years, from 1999 to 2013. And a very interesting aspect of the S-Files were the different shifts in format, in terms of its periodicity, size, foci, etc., over the years, but always being a central reference for the research and the promotion and the conversation between Latino artists. So I guess my question is that to you, Susanna and Elia, and for myself and for the whole, just, you know, setting the tone for our conversation, what would we change in this exhibition if we were to do it again? What would we like to change if we would do this show again? Or what we didn't do in this edition that we would like to see done, and, you know, as part of a next vision for the next one or next ones of the Trienal, given this is a first of a series.
I mean, one thing first and foremost that I know we all are really, really anxious to see happen in the future is, of course, something that was really out of our hands due to the current global health situation. But I know from the start, you, Rodrigo, me, and Elia, we were always really thinking about having performance being a major component of the show, and also film. We were thinking of doing a film series and screening, maybe in El Museo's Teatro. And I'm so pleased that this weekend we were finally able to bring people together, and we were able to have some actions from Carolina Caicedo and Elaine Rodriguez. We also were able to make a really beautiful workaround with Carlos Martial. But I think that lack of being physically together. I mean, I'm so glad we can have this Zoom today with people coming in from all over the Americas, actually, but it's still something, you know, that hasn't been quite the same. And Elia really lovingly this week brought together some hand in hand with that inability to have performance is the gathering. And yeah, Elia brought together some S-Files artists this past week. We were all talking about the reality that
yes,
that we're missing.
yeah, you know, I think we talked a few minutes about after parties and things like that. But aside from that, I mean, that's clearly was missing. You know, all the celebration. But it was great to have the artists come in, the ones that were able to come in and just celebrate. And one of the things with the S-Files having participated is this like finding this community, right? This sense of community and the sense of belonging that even with some of these artists having had big exhibitions and national, regular quote unquote museums still felt that they connected more here at El Museo and what the mission was. Of course, that's not, I don't find that a critique. I find that like a continuation of what it is. But getting back to, yes, needing more performance and film, but also to, and we discussed this a little bit, do we include Basquiat in this show? Like including a little bit more historical figures or older artists. I mean, we did have a few, but I think maybe the point was to kind of highlight what was happening now, especially the political moment that we had. But I think maybe the next iteration can deal with the present, but also with the past as well, and how that kind of intersects. And I think Joey Terrell's work really kind of touched upon that, him dealing, when he did his paintings, with dealing with, as a man living with AIDS and that AIDS virus versus, the COVID we were dealing with. Not the same, but still kind of like that connection. So I hope, I think if we could see more of that, that would be quite amazing as well. Because I don't think people know that Latinx art has a long history in the United States. And I think it's important to interconnect the past with the present.
Yes, so absolutely. This is something I remember discussing right at the beginning and being very somehow strict about this, because I think something that was really like on the top of the agenda for the show was to reflect the art of the present. And I think that's been a mandate for the S-Files in general, with like a generational flexibility, right? But we came up with this rule that even Joey's work, who's an artist as well as Candida, both are the artists in the show that have been working for long, but we decided to include only 21st century created artworks. I think there's always a sense of historical revision through the biennials and triennials around the world. But we decided to go for a more present, contemporary, of now, like a more like art of now approach to the exhibition. But I do agree with you, Elliot, that as a result of that, we somehow didn't address the historicity of the field. That's something that you brought up. I know you mentioned Basquiat in the beginning. I remember that Basquiat was a name that we discussed at the very beginning. I would say, like, let's just do living artists. Let's just do 21st century. And let's also just do artists with like a recent history with El Museo, with the exception of Candida. And that it's something that I agree with you, that now when I look at the show, I love the show. But for next iterations, new curators working on this platform, I think this would be a point of consideration for them on how to encompass more a historical sense to the narrative of the exhibition. One aspect that I see, a lot of biennials and triennials is like this strong interest for the 60s and 70s. And I think there's a big blind spot in terms of the mainstream art field having more understanding of Latinos, Latinas producing in the States during those decades. Of course, we have very important monograph exhibitions, or even like more broader approaches, like the Smithsonian exhibition, Nuestra America, Our America. It's a perfect example of that. But I think the ability to create this generational or dialogues or frictions, or to give it more historicities, I agree with you. as like something that could be explored in other iterations of the exhibition.
I mean, we're talking about debriefing. That's the title of our conversation today. And I know one of the things we wanted to all debrief was also the reception to the show that I mean, not only our own, but how we perceive the reception on the part of audiences and also art critics, which I think we all feel really blessed by all of the really positive response that we've had. And we even had, you know, new press coming out this week, the last week. But at the same time, it's also been curious to me to see what I'll describe as like insider, outsider voices on the part of the press, how Latinx critics or critics who are more attuned to Latinx circles have a different and in some cases maybe more nuanced perceptions to the show. I'm still seeing some interesting biases on the part of critics who are still really looking for the color in Latinx art, and certainly, you know, there is a lot of color in our show, and I love it, and that's not a detraction, but I think we're still seeing how certain stereotypes are being expected on the part of some of the people who are visiting us. And I'm curious what Elia or Rodrigo, what your thoughts are on that.
I see that more in like the press by, you know, having read it all of them, you know, there is that little like expectation. There's also too, because a lot of the work in the show, a lot of it is connected to particular histories, to family, and somehow that's like work, I feel, that is kind of poo-pooed in a way that it's not acknowledged as being something worth still exploring, because, you know, it's not multiculturalism, it's not the 90s, it's not the early 2000s. And so you have to sit there and wonder, but that was like 20 years ago. So there is like a revisiting of this kind of thing. But I think there's like a lag when it comes to the media. And you're right, it's like Latino art is only murals. You know, we kind of confronted that when we were I'm not going to name names, but when we were going to do something for a TV, you know, they wanted to go into this other aspect and just kind of, it just kind of limits the conversation. How do we change that? I don't know. I do think having shows like this, because it wasn't everyone, I do think shows like this kind of show the broader scale. And getting back to the critique, and one of the things that we talked about was this idea of work not having this kind of conceptual work, which I think all art is conceptual, but I think that's also the way it is seen, that it's only addressing the self. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but I think it's really a problem with the media, but I also think it's just an extension of how there's still a lot of room to work on when it comes to people understanding Latinx.
Yeah, I think this is something that was actually a good, the show had a strong response. No, that's something I personally was not expecting. So not because of the intrinsically of the show, but because of the S-Files interruption and several aspects of that history. But I think when we bring up how was it received in the reviews, which were many, and I think for the most part, very favorable and very positive, I would say that this brings me back to the previous question we were discussing of the historicity. Because I think it's this is just to self-critique mesmo, no? I mean, to be very open about this, that even in terms of historical references, we should have been more aware of making these connections more visible in terms of like wall texts, because of that history. Sometimes that's what's missing. And I love when you say that conceptual art, every art is conceptual, and I totally agree with that. But there's a lineage, there's a matrix that is very much on the European, white American dialogue, that it's not where most of the show comes from. Or when it touches on that, it's in a more critical way, it's in a more subversive way, in a more transgressive way. And sometimes that's oversight by critics, because some of the references are missing. No, and I think that's an interesting, I mean, this sounds a little bit under-articulate, but this is an point of interest to really think on how these generations of artists that we portrayed in the show, they are bringing this historical legacy to a new moment, a new stage of processing, of reprocessing, that it's really important to educate the audiences about. No, I mean, that's from an institutional mission perspective. So, I mean, without trying to be conclusive about this, I think there was a term that was used a couple of times that says that the show is imperfect. And I think that imperfection is, we're two reviews, like 3 days apart, in and on mainstream media, and they both use this word, imperfection. One of them also does something that I found very interesting. That's exactly where Elia was going. It does describe the show as like a negative, like not negative, but like the absence of, like, you don't see empty galleries, you don't see this, you don't see that. But at the same time, you don't see the stereotypes that these writers were expecting to see. And I think this how do you say this? Neither either. I mean,
either or.
No, neither or. Thank you. That's a very creative and potent, powerful position for the artist to be. No, and I love that some artists push back on social media, not to name names, as you say, but that, when message delivered, I felt like this, and that was like a good moment. It felt good to me.
And either or, this whole idea of either or, and it's like push and pull. I think many artists of Latinx descent are dealing with this in because they're living in this like middle space, right, or the third space, if we're going to get theoretical about it. So it makes sense that the works are feeling that way or being expressed in that way.
To
go ahead, please.
Okay, go ahead, Susanna.
I was going to say, to go back to the imperfect, I mean, moving away from that, I think to something, a different way of framing it is, I was rereading our essay this morning in preparation of this, and it even struck me more now than it did at the time of our writing, how open-ended, especially you, Elia, of course, tackling the term Latinx, which we've all from the start been describing as contested, and maybe will not be the next term for the next show, who knows, but this sense of open-endedness and expansiveness. I mean, I also was thinking to myself, I mean, this is, yes, we have the history of the S-Files and the legacy of the S-Files behind us, and the legacy of Latinx art history, as we've been discussing. But this is still the inaugural, it's the inaugural La Trienal. And I think it is really exciting for us to be, that this sense of what's next was really kind of baked into this initial version from the start. I don't even know how conscious we always were, but it feels like there's more to come in a sense.
I agree with you. I feel like this exhibition is kind of like the foundation of what it's just not going to, not a foundation, not just for the museum, but in general, to really think about what it is to be Latino, what it is to be a Latino artist in not New York City, around the country.
I wanted to just mention another thing that I touched on very briefly on the intro. I know time is short, but maybe to collect your thoughts, Susanna and Elia, on the intersectional approach we decided to use for the show, to which I attribute also the success of the show in creating a very diverse platform, an exhibition that as a survey, there's a lot of people who can identify with the exhibition, which I think it's an important aspect, because when you, as I said before, when you embrace this format, I think this is a very important mandate. So, or aspect of what you decide to do is to really express or represent diversity in the group of artists. So I just wanted to hear from you, Elia and Susanna, on that.
Well, I mean, I think like intersectionality and it should be mandate for all exhibitions, not just El Museo, because it's like we're, especially, I think especially now in this time where, I mean, and I think after George Floyd, it really just kind of shook everybody up. And it's just part of how we have to address culture. Art is part of the culture. And so I just think it's just the way an institution should approach when they're doing an exhibition. And I still have yet to see that. I don't see that consistently. I don't see that often. So, I think it was something we all decided to do. We were all on board with that. And and you have to ask yourself, when we were doing it, we had to ask ourselves hard questions and look at, and revisit who was selected and who wasn't and why. And we had to really look at that. And it's not easy to be intersectional, but it's really the way we should be looking at art as well.
And I mean, I know we are really close to time, but I think there's room for more. And I also do attribute our emphasis on intersectionality. I mean, we were being very conscious about it, but I really think that there was like a deep spirit of collaboration embedded in this show, not only amongst the three of us, but amongst the think tanks that we hosted, our conversations with our peers, our reaching out to other curators, conversations with the artists themselves. It's like a cacophony of voices, and that's how this multiplicity that's embedded within intersectionality, I think that's how, it's gonna continue to arise to the surface.
Well, wonderful. So now I know time goes by so quick. No, I could continue having this conversation for at least another 30 minutes.
Yes.
But we came to our time mark, I'm afraid. So I would like to just invite everybody who's attending. We have wonderful comments in the chat box. I would like to invite everybody to stay tuned for the next panel in a minute time, and to continue to interact with our speakers through the Q&A. So thank you, Elia and Susanna, and stay tuned, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start. It's 2:35. Hi, my name is Marcela Guerrero, and I am the Jennifer Rubio Associate Curator at the Whitney Museum. I come to you today from the ancestral lands of the Lenape and Munsee Canarsie. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating this panel, Latinx on View, with three esteemed colleagues, Julie Rodriguez Woodholm, Elizabeth Ferrer, and Cecilia Fajardo Hill. Together, we will discuss what it means to exhibit Latinx art at this particular moment. I want to start, however, by stating the obvious, which is that we're here together near the end of the run of ESTAMOS BIEN, el Museo del Barrio's triennial exhibition that has put Latinx art on view for the past 7 months. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate the curators and the artists on presenting an exhibition that grapples with the most pressing issues surrounding Latinx identity in the US. The show is also as much an affirmation of an identity as it is a questioning of its tenets. Like the monumental effort that Susana, Elia, and Rodrigo have accomplished with Estamos Bien, the three speakers on this panel have also embarked on diverse projects that have brought visibility to Latinx art this past pandemic year. We will start with Julia Rodriguez Woodholm, who is director of the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. Prior to her current role, Woodholm was director and chief curator at the DePaul Art Museum in Chicago. At DPAM, she launched the Enviable Latinx Initiative, a multi-year commitment focused on addressing the dearth of representation of US-based artists of Latin American descent. She will be speaking about all the facets of this major initiative and how she's extending these efforts in her new home at BAMFA. I've never read that acronym. I'm assuming that it's BAMFA. Following Woodholm's presentation, we will hear Elizabeth Ferrer, who is Vice President of Contemporary Art at BRIC, a nonprofit arts and media organization based in Brooklyn. Ferrer is also a photography scholar and a prolific writer with several books and essays under her belt. Today, she will be addressing two recent projects, the exhibition Latinx Abstract and her latest book, Latinx Photography in the United States, A Visual History. Our third speaker is Cecilia Fajardo Hill, a British Venezuelan art historian and curator focusing on Latin American and Latinx art. Fajardo Hill has held several distinguished positions in institutions such as the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach and the Cisneros Fontanals Arts Foundation in Miami. She was a co-curator of Radical Women, Latin American Art 1960-1985, along with Andrea Junta, and with whom I had the pleasure of being the curatorial fellow for that show. In her role as an independent curator, Fajardo Hill recently curated the exhibition Absence Presence, Latinx and Latin American Artists in Dialogue at Another Space, an exhibition space founded and conceived by the collector, Dr. Estrellita Brodsky. Fajardo Hill will be discussing Absence Presence, which is still on view through October 9th. In addition to the artworks and artists included in the recent exhibitions and projects that the speakers have undertaken and that they will surely talk about, I'm interested in unpacking the title of this panel, Latinx on View, by discussing this moment in time and the backdrop against which these projects were presented. Specifically, what was the angle or approach that each exhibition sought to foreground that perhaps hadn't been done before and that required this moment to happen? As we further unpack the title of the panel, I am interested in learning how we're amplifying the art and the artists that are on view. For example, we often count on colleagues in the education, publication, and communications departments who help us disseminate the ideas of the show and to reach wider audiences. Also, as curators, we know that exhibitions are one piece in the ecosystem of the arts, and that putting an artist's work on view has repercussions in terms of collecting, whether institutionally or privately, and in bolstering further visibility in other exhibitions. So again, when we say Latinx on view, what beyond the art are we making visible? Finally, Latinx on view also assumes a viewership, an audience that hopefully sees themselves represented in what we're presenting and cares about its content. As curators, with deep commitments to Latinx art, we want to show art that is relevant to an audience that deems it that way. especially given this long year we have just experienced, in which we have survived a pandemic and had seen the effects of white supremacy in pretty blunt ways. We have a responsibility to revise to whom and for whom is the art that is on view. With that in mind, I wonder, as the last question in my opening remarks, how are we leaning into the potential of the X in Latinx to bring visibility to groups that were and continue to be excluded from this category? These are just some framing questions to the panel, but I'm sure the people who are watching will have many more. Each speaker will have 10 minutes to present, and we will go to the Q&A portion of the panel right after every speaker has presented. But please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function at any point during the talk. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Julie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela, and thank you so much for this invitation. I'm honored to be participating in this conversation this afternoon. I will share my screen. Let's see if this works, hopefully. Let's see. Okay. So I'm Julie Rodriguez-Widholm, Director of UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive since last summer. I think it's important to visualize the site in which we work because my work has always been very responsive to the community I'm in and where I'm working. So this is an image of my current place of work at UC Berkeley. But mostly I'll be talking about the work I did while I was Director and Chief Curator at DePaul Art Museum in Chicago. I was there from 2015 to 2020. And one of the most kind of important things I wanted to accomplish while I was there was to think about how we could, with the resources and capacity that we had as a fairly small academic art museum, make change in the museum field and really start to take some action around what I perceive to be a real lack of visibility and participation and opportunities for US-based Latinx artists, US-based artists of Latin American heritage. And so kind of taking a multi-year model, in many ways inspired by the Terra Foundation's Art Design Chicago initiative, which was multi-year, I thought, what would it mean for us to really dig deeply into this work from various perspectives and modes of working? And how can we do this to launch a set of questions that embrace the contradictions, the complexities, and histories of these questions, including the term Latinx itself? How could we formalize an ongoing commitment to increase participation in exhibitions, collections, and publications, and really hopefully make this work part of the fabric and DNA of DePaul Art Museum's work into the future? So with my incredible team, we launched the initiative in around 2018. And I will be sharing some examples of work that was part of the initiative and dive a little bit deeper into the culminating exhibition that closed fairly recently. Oops, let's see here. So in terms of some exhibitions, now I'm not suggesting that we had sort of exclusively Latinx exhibitions for a few years. No, rather it was interweaving this work into the other projects we did, like a Sengen and Gudi retrospective, to really fold this into a dynamic dialogue with other kinds of work. We had a commission with Eric J. Garcia as part of the National Veterans Art Museum Triennial, which is a site-specific commission. We brought an incredible exhibition from the Perez Art Museum organized by Maria Elena Ortiz, the solo exhibition of Firele Baez, Vessels of Genealogies. Our associate curator at the time, Mia Lopez, organized a group exhibition with 2 Chicago-based artists and 2 artists from San Antonio of Latin American descent. And a core part of this initiative was to think about what actions could we take, right? Also with limited resources, limited staff and everything, but with a clear focus and intention to change art history, to change what's in our collections. And so I decided, or we decided as a staff, to dedicate all of our acquisition funds to the purchase of Latinx artists for several years. And the first acquisition we made was Harold Mendez, this piece here. We also were privileged to receive some gifts from collectors in the community. Chuck Thoreau gave us this piece by Candida Alvarez from 2001. Scott Hunter, a local collector, gave us this piece by Mario Ibarra, an LA-based artist. And then in terms of purchases, we did have a strong desire to fold Chicago-based artists into this initiative as well, and incredibly important to have a kind of local commitment as well as a national commitment. So we purchased this work by Yvette Mayorga, an incredibly exciting and interesting artist in Chicago. Maria Gaspar, we purchased this photograph. Melissa Leandro, so this piece on the left was in that exhibition curated by Mia Lopez. We ended up buying the work out of that exhibition. The piece on the right is by Edward Soto, an incredible Chicago-based artist, as I'm sure many of you know of her. We brought this work, and these are all the first examples of these artists' works in the DePaul Art Museum collection. And so a major aspect of this initiative was an exhibition culled from the museum's collection, which had some strengths in Latin American work, but it was really a query. I mean, we were curious, what do we have? And how did we get it? And what are we lacking? You know, in terms of a museum collection, why don't we have more work? And how can we increase the number of works in the collection? And so it set out really as a kind of research project to see what we had. The title Latinx American was a consideration of this intersection. The X is sort of the intersection of Latin and American. And it's a question, right? And I think we wanted to also be very transparent about the lack in our collection, and to ask questions about what that means and how we can maybe start to change the way that collections help inform exhibitions, help inform art histories. It was also, I want to point out that there's an incredible website that was made for this exhibition, because unfortunately it was launched during the pandemic. And so we had to shift gears, and there's a really wonderful virtual exhibition with texts and kind of installation views that I encourage you to view. I want to say also that what was, I think, very unique and special about this was that it was very much curated by several staff. So this kind of collective input into interpretation, into decisions was incredibly important. Everyone from, myself as director to interns took part in curating this show. I also want to give special thanks to Lara Caroline DeLatta, the interim director of DePaul Art Museum, and Yoni Behar, the assistant curator there now, who really took this show after I left and installed it and made it, amplified it, added work to the checklist, and did an incredible job really taking the initiative and this exhibition and programming to new heights, far beyond what I could have imagined, and I'm so thankful to them. So it occupied the entire museum. And I just want to share some slides of the artists. You can kind of see who was in the collection, who was acquired. We did borrow some works also to juxtapose with the works in the collection, but just to give you a sense of who was in the exhibition, emerging Chicago-based artists all the way up to or some artists who've passed, which created, I think, a quite dynamic juxtaposition of generations and conversations throughout the exhibition. And then I also want to mention that we had some generous funding from the Warhol Foundation, and we wanted to think about how we could support other entities and organizations in Chicago to help collaborate on this work. So we supported Ivan Lozano to do a podcast with several of the artists in the exhibition. And as you can see here, it's available on Spotify and other sources, but we thought these oral histories, these kind of conversations with artists and documenting this work was incredibly important. And so we were thrilled to be able to support him in that. He did a wonderful job. And then also the public programming kind of, fortuitously, as we had to all adapt to virtual programming, we were able to record all of this. Great conversations, again, trying to open up the dialogue around the complexities of the notions of identity, the notions of Latinx art, everything from, queer networks, exploring works in the collection, borders and periphery. So I encourage everyone to, again, utilize this kind of base of knowledge and questioning that was beautifully documented and presented by the staff at DePaul Art Museum. And I just want to briefly mention that now that I'm at UC Berkeley, I'm thinking about how this work is going to take place here, given the amazing faculty we have, the communities we have here, the concerns and histories of California, which are very different than Chicago. And so I just want to share that we are organizing the first retrospective of Amalia Mesa Baines. This will be co-curated by Esther Fernandez and Laura Perez. For spring 2023, it will hopefully have a tour. Amalia Mesa Baines is, of course, one of the pioneering leading Chicanx artists, scholars, writers, thinkers, and it's a long overdue, I think, recognition of her impact in the field. And we hope that this will coincide with the Latino Art Now conference, which will be hosted at UC Berkeley at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was perfect in terms of timing and content, of course. And now we'll ask Elizabeth Ferrer to join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcela. And I just want to thank everyone at El Museo for the Estamos Bien exhibition, which has been wonderful to see and experience. And also just thank all of you for being here. As Marcela mentioned, I'm going to be talking about two projects. The first is Latinx Abstract, which is an exhibition that I curated at Brick House, and it was on view for the first half of this year. Can we please have the slides? Thank you. So we can jump to the next slide. And this is a view of the gallery at Brick House. So I curated the show because I've always gravitated to abstract art, and I was becoming increasingly aware in my work as a curator of contemporary art that there are a lot of Latinx artists who work with abstraction, but their work has not been part of the critical discourse. So I really wanted to challenge this exclusion from kind of two sides. On the first, I wanted to challenge mainstream points of view about abstract art, which has long been dominated by a Eurocentric narrative that has long privileged certain voices while excluding others, as we all know. And at the same time, I also wanted to challenge notions and expectations of Latinx art and to highlight abstraction as a vital but overlooked aspect of Latinx artistic production. So the exhibition included 10 artists who work with various media. As you can see, there was painting, works on paper, sculpture, installation, even sound art. And the exhibition also by design was cross-generational. There were artists who ranged in age from their 30s to their 80s. And two of the artists, Fanny Sanin, who you can catch a little bit of glimpse behind the pillar on the left, and Freddie Rodriguez, who's on the far right. Both of these artists have been pursuing abstract art, each for over a half century. And of course, in this regard, we can also think of a pioneering figure like Carmen Herrera, and there are others. So what I wanted to do was simply underscore that abstraction has an enduring legacy among Latinx artists. So in curating the exhibition, I had a while to curate it because of quarantine, and we were delayed in presenting the show. I ended up having to do all the studio visits virtually. But as I was working on the show, some really interesting themes emerged for me about how Latinx artists approach abstraction, about their sources, and how they infuse new meaning into abstract languages. So for example, if we can go to the next slide, we can see, for example, one more slide, please, I'm sorry. So for example, one of these artists, one of the younger artists in the show was Sarah Zapata. And she's one of a few that look back to pre-Columbian cultures. Her family is Peruvian, and she freely manipulates both ancient and more contemporary textile techniques to explore varied elements of her identity. I think there's one more slide by her. And then we can move to the next couple of slides. This is an installation by Mary Valverde, who has a research-based practice and creates these complex installations that integrate pre-Hispanic Andean geometric forms and concepts of order to make pointed statements about the kinds of knowledge that were suppressed or lost with colonization. The next slide, please. That's a close-up of her work. And then we can move on to the next two. And then in contrast, there's Carlos Carcamo, who you see on the left. His canvases appear to be indebted to minimalism and to color field painting, and they are, but these works also contain obscured graffiti tags, which he uses in a conceptual language of remixing and recontextualizing the formal language of abstraction. I think there's one more. Thank you. And moving on. One more, please. And then likewise, Glendalis Medina takes an array of influences, the hip hop culture that she grew up with in the Bronx, Taino symbolism, a boombox that has become a kind of touchstone for her, in geometric form to create an autonomous symbolic language that reflects new value structures very personal to her. So if we can keep moving on, another work by Glendalis, and then we can stay here for a moment. No, we can stay there, please, on the Black work. So there is a strong overlay of political and social and cultural references in this work. Abstraction can be coded or manipulated to act as a personal language, as with Glendalis, or one that's embedded with culturally relevant information. We can move on to the next one. So even the use of the color gold by a formalist like Freddie Rodriguez becomes significant. He casts this color on the one hand as an emblem of colonial exploitation, and on the other as a sign of present-day corruption in the Americas. So, all of these artists, of course, are also thinking about the formal elements of composition, especially a figure like Rodriguez. This was one of the earliest works in the show from 1974. When he arrived in New York, he was going to MoMA and looking at paintings by Mondrian and Frank Stella, or another figure, Fanny Sanin. She's been devoted to abstraction since she emerged as an artist in Latin America in the 1960s. We can have the next slide, please. And this is a work by Fanny. Next one, please. I don't have time to talk about every artist in the show, but I would be remiss to not include Candida Alvarez, who is wonderful to work with, and who, of course, is so integral to Estamos Bien. I was so intrigued to learn that she grew up very near Brick House, where this exhibition took place, and she talks about how even as a child, she saw everything as abstract form. So in a work like this, there are allusions to everyday life, to her art historical heroes, to nature, to elements of her Puerto Rican heritage, while also functioning as pure, lush abstractions. The exhibition was accompanied by a few panel discussions, all held virtually, as well as by a printed catalog, and you can find that all on the BRIC website. So I'm now going to move quickly to another project that I worked on, one that had a much longer gestation, and that's my book, Latinx Photography in the United States, A Visual History, which came out earlier this year. And while this was a personal project, I want to talk about it in an institutional context, because Latinx photographers have been largely absent from museums and collections. I was motivated to write this book by a single fact. Photography by Latinx artists has been essentially excluded from the documented history of photography. There have been Latinx practitioners of the medium nearly since its beginnings in 1839. Although much of this early work has been lost, a lot of it was made in portrait studios, and a lot of it was made anonymously. There has been no comprehensive book on this subject before mine, no major museum survey. I think the last survey was a survey in 1995 at PhotoFest in Houston, the photography festival, and scant inclusion of these photographers in the kinds of books or critical writings that create the canon of photography. And I did not want these bodies of work to be lost. Since the book was published, we've already lost some of these photographers, including Adal and Sophie Rivera, who just passed very recently. The next slide, please. And here's a work by Sophie. The photographers that I discuss in the book, there are about 80, have made essential contributions in representing the visual history of people and communities that represent some 18% of the US population. And of course, this population is growing. Their omission from the historical record limits our understanding of a broader history of photography, of Latinx art, and of important dimensions of American identity. Now, I cover a lot of ground in the book. There are about 80 photographers in the book, and a handful are from the 19th century and a few from the early 20th century. But the book really begins in earnest in, can I have the next slide, please? The book really begins in earnest in the 1960s, the civil rights era, when Latinx photographers were working really for the first time with a sense of political consciousness and sense of cultural pride. This early work was documentary and political in nature. Photographers were in Central California, witnessing the rise of the farm workers' labor movement. Next slide, please. And in the streets of Los Angeles and in Chicago and in New York, where the Young Lords and other activist groups were pressing for equal rights. This pioneering generation was not only exposing social ills, this is a school walkout in Los Angeles, also protesting the lack of good education, but for the first time, documenting their communities from the inside. Next slide, please. So what emerged from that was a more nuanced look at life in places like Spanish Harlem or in East Los Angeles, where I grew up. And in this regard, I would single out the work of Hira Maristani, who is no stranger to audiences at El Museo, who was making street photographs like these in the 1960s. So I cover a lot of ground in the book, as I mentioned, moving on to more artistic approaches. I think we just need to scroll through some of these images fairly quickly now. And I then moved to talking about ideas around identity, the family, the archive, more conceptual work. But in closing, what I want to say is that this is changing. I hope that the book has had some impact in this regard. Hira Maristani will take part in PS1's Greater New York. The Cleveland Museum is organizing an exhibition that will include historic Chicanx work. And El Museo will be presenting historic work by Enfoco, the Bronx Photography Collective. So there's a lot more work to be done. There's a lot more work to be exposed, but I do hope that this book is having a role in increasing the consciousness of our photographic legacy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was perfect. You took the 30 seconds that Julie didn't use. And now I'm going to turn it to Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon for you, still morning for me. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure also that Marcela is the moderator of this session. So I was invited to speak about absence presence, Latinx and Latin American artists in dialogue. So I will share some images while I discuss a little bit some of the issues that thank you. Okay, so the issue. So in fact, at the Triennial, there are some artists that are also at the Absence and Presence exhibition, which is really interesting that it happened that way. This was a great opportunity. Estrellita Brodsky, who is the founder of Another Space, gave me. She proposed to do an exhibition of Latinx art. As she has such an interesting collection of Latin American artists, I thought it would be a great opportunity to establish an open dialogue between Latin America and Latinx, because still now, I mean, I originally as an art historian come from European art and then moved into Latin American art. And around 2010, when I moved to LA and started working on the Mexele exhibition, Mexele, Mexican Modernists in Latin America, at the Museum of Latin American Art, which was curated by Rubén Ortiz Torres and Jesse Lerner, it became like a huge realization, this notion of, at the time, Chicano art and Latinx art and so forth. And then when we worked on Radical Women in 2017, I actually specifically worked in the Latinx and in the Latina and Chicana as a section of the exhibition with Marcela Guerrero. So it became like a very urgent thing. But one of the things I've realized in the field is that now the term Latinx doesn't only include notions of intersectionality, but also includes a broader ocean of what Latinx may be. For example, someone like me that have been here in the US since 2003, I consider myself a Latina now. But there are still a tendency both in academia and in the field to separate both Latin American and the Latinx art community. And I feel that this is something that we need to work on, so that the very notion of decoloniality for me, decolonizing art history, to have this sort of intersectional presence of a series of artists and idea, passes also through the notion of
solidarity and dialogue and conversation. And in this specific exhibition, there were 3 themes: affectivity, justice, and self-being, but it was all transversed by the notion of absence, because there is an enormous absence, not only in the art field, but in society, in terms of a representation that is just, that is complex, that is non-stereotypical. When we started working with Latin American, when I was starting to work in Latin American art as an art historian in the 90s, I mean, it was a very big issue. Now it seems to be separated, which is really not the case. But the point is that we share a colonial history, we share a colonial reality, we share a lot of notions, and the notion of absence passes through the fact that this invisibility is determined by patriarchalism, racism, violence, classism, and the visibility, there is an agency which is diluted and also distorted. And I think art and the artists in the exhibition show us a very strong way in which this can be countered, resistant. There is a notion of resilience. And I think here there is a bridge with the Museo del Barrio, because this notion of ESTAMOS BIEN, even though, for example, this exhibition speaks very strongly of the idea that there is a denunciation of injustice and violence and racism, but at the same time, behind it, there is this notion of sort of not only resistance, but a poetic affirmation, also some of it really activist. And I like very much to think of Jose Esteban Muñoz's notion of feeling brown and notion of affectivity is an affectivity that is non-hegemonic. It passes through the fact that there is a solidarity between what we consider to be brown and Black bodies, but also is a notion of a political doing and becoming that is unregulated and unclassifiable. So for example, these images we have here, if you look at the image on the right-hand side on the bottom is Juana Valdez, who is an Afro-Cuban artist, with this work that really talks about the color of the skin without hierarchies. And then at the end of this entryway is Guadalupe Maravilla with this piece, which is both an altar, a musical instrument, a healing sculpture. Then if you see on the upper left of the screen, there is Sandy Rodriguez that embeds her work in this sort of notion of codices and amate paper, and sort of notions of reclaimed territory. And then you have Ken Gonzalez Day talking about the invisible history of lynching in the West. And then down on the upper right hand side, you have Carolina Caicedo talking about water rights. And then you have in the front the glass piece by Jocelyn Carvalho talking about notions of anoxia, lack of oxygen. And then on the left-hand side on the bottom, you have another section of the exhibition. Again, you can see I'm using Guadalupe Maravilla to talk about this sense of conversation, discussion, the way that there is an intersection in what is being presented, discussed, and made visible, you know, like Patrick Martinez at the end, all men are created equal, with the equal sort of turned off, or Narciso Martinez paying homage to workers during the time of the pandemic. Here there is one of the sections where you can see a little bit more the dialogue between the pieces, for example, Marcos Dimas at the end, which has a really interesting dialogue with Guadalupe Maravilla, because it's a sort of a spirit catcher that talks about the sort of Afro-Taino background in Puerto Rico. Here, this belongs very much to the section of affectivity. You have on the top right and the top left, Dominique de Rezer with this really beautiful piece, which for me talks really about all these bodies that have been brought together, that there is sort of sewing. So there is a painful situation in the way that the body has been fragmented, the Black body. And then you have Dalaila Montoya talking about the separation of the separation that happened during the Trump administration between children and parents, or Hu Nilsson, or for example, Cristina Fernandez talking about injustice towards field workers during the Chicano, era, you know, the Chicano movement, so for me, what is important about this decoloniality here is the fact that just creating archives of this history, for someone to care to talk about the histories of someone who has been completely forgotten and disappeared from the history bodies that want to be together. Or for example, here there was a thread that passed through the whole exhibition, which talked about indigeneity. And this was very much made visible in the section of self and being, where you have, for example, here a piece by Manuel Antonio Pichilla, who's a Maya Sutuhil artist from Guatemala, who already had from pre-Columbian time, or Claudia Pedia Salinas. And then you have Laura Aguilar, you know, at the end with a body in the landscape, in the California landscape, Martin Gutierrez, dressed with clothing that belong also to her, you know, ancestral indigenous past, or Sophie Rivera, Delilah Montoya, Patsy Rivera. And again, this sort of a very intersection, and also this sort of feminine notion, or Joyri Minaya talking about sort of stereotypes imposed on the body. And my last slide, I hope I'm on time because I forgot to set my alarm. So Marcela let me know. We had 4 film screening, and for me it's interesting to see them together. Patricia Valencia with this piece, we are about to end, and then had Coco Fusco, Beatriz Santiago Muñoz, Maria Adela Diaz, all talking from a different perspective of these issues that we have, either is racism, gender violence, you know, the obliteration of the pre-Columbian past, or issues with the COVID. So this is, of course, very short, but the whole point is that I wanted to open up a dialogue between the Latinx and Latin America through this notion of a possible feeling brown, sort of shared affectivities and solidarities in the field, taking the cue from the artists themselves, are always the wisest and the most inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. If the other speakers can turn on their cameras, and oops, I want to make sure that I'm seeing the questions. Okay, I think some questions are starting to come in. I have some questions for each of you. Hopefully I'll have time to ask them, and then we'll turn to the Q&A per se. Julie, I was wondering, you said at one point that you wanted to be transparent about the lack of, you know, of what DPAM was lacking in terms of the collection. And this is particularly where I find it that you were doing this even slightly before this whole reckoning with museums and asking museums for more transparency. And so my question is, you know, I'm wondering about the thinking behind that. It takes a lot of, it sounds a little ridiculous, but courage on the part of museums to be this, you know, transparent. What was the thinking behind that?
The thinking behind it, well, it's sort of an approach that I embrace, which is that for most of us, we've inherited these structures and traditions of, you know, museum work and collecting habits and traditions. And so I, as a curator and museum director, I'm quite interested in using the museum as a space for questioning too, and critique. And I also strongly believe if you can't name it, you can't fix it. So I think to talk about these things and bring it out into the open to explore why that's the case, like, you know, to really talk about what are the conditions that have set up the collection as it is, and how can we think about intentionally, purposefully, actively shifting the way collections are built, where we can, with great purpose and focus too, make change, and where do we put our dollars and our resources. You know, I'm interested in labels, you know, exhibition labels at DePaul Art Museum. We would be sort of in some ways playful, but also I think questioning how we label artists, and open up a lot of space for making sure that we are in dialogue with living artists about how they want to be represented in their labels. Or, you know, many artists in the show don't necessarily identify as Latinx. And so giving space for those questions and modifications, I think, is incredibly important, and bringing the viewer into those questions with us, right? So it's kind of, in some ways, we want to keep the trust between the museum and the audience, but we can reduce the authority or the sense of, well, we have all the answers. And rather, we want to bring visitors into the questions with us. And so they can learn about how museums work too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the embracing of the imperfect, what Rodrigo was talking at the beginning, is something that's not very much practiced in museums. Elizabeth, I was wondering, between your Latinx abstract exhibition and the book, I realized, in the Latinx abstract exhibition, there weren't any photographs, but I'm sure both projects were informing each other as you were both working in both of them. And perhaps in the book, there might be more examples of abstraction in photography, but I wonder if that was a conscious decision in terms of, photography as a medium and what you were trying, the threads and topics that you were trying to tell weren't perhaps told through abstract photography. I'm sure you've thought a lot about of those two, whether you wanted to keep them separate or how you see them informing each other.
Well, actually, they didn't inform each other because I had finished the book maybe a year earlier. And so, we were spending a good amount of time getting permissions, from the photographers themselves and from their estates, and then going through a heavy editing process. So I had actually sort of finished the writing part of the book quite a while earlier. But I think it's an interesting question because I did not find a lot of purely abstract photography among Latinx photographers. And now you're going to make me want to go and search and find artists who are doing that. I just was very excited to find people that were doing, conceptual approaches, or there were photographers who were real pioneers in digital approaches, but not so much the abstract mode. So I think that would be something that I would need to further investigate.
Yeah, I think Muriel Hasbun and Karina Aguilera-Skiversky are deal with abstraction in their work, but
yes, definitely.
But yeah, and Cecilia, I had a question for you that kind of overlaps or is similar to a question that I see in the chat. And for me, my question was more about that decolonial approach that I know you're researching now at the Clark Institute. But the question per se that's on the chat says, can the curators, and I'll make this one specifically for you, unless the other speakers want to weigh in, but it says, can the curators weigh in on the decision to mobilize Latin America / Latinx as opposed to art of the Americas?
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I'm thinking very, very deeply about this. Well, you think of notions of the hemispheric and geography. I think I actually published an essay, which is on the website of Another Space, where I discuss a fair amount of length, what will be this connection between the Latinx and the Latin American. There is not only a colonial history, but there is a, the root that we actually share, which is a colonial root, is the notion of the Latin. That's the commonality of it. And the Latin, for example, when we think of some country like Haiti, we think, oh, what is it? But then, the more I think of the coloniality, I think, yeah, but Africa will be really the connection here with our history, the indigenous Africa, intersectionality, notions of popular culture and vernacular culture. But I do feel that there are certain specificities that we share as this sort of Latin American, Latinx sort of type of historiography, where, we saw this even in Radical Women, that there were this sort of connection in terms of this type of themes of oppression, repression, and also this political imagination, experimentality. I think you could make the case, for example, of African American, but I feel that, when you try to be so comprehensive, it's so encyclopedic, it ends up becoming a generality. And I think there is so much cultural specificity that can be kind of spelled out through these sort of common issues, social issues, colonial histories, and sort of this connection with ideas of ethnicity, which from my point of view, I think is very valuable. I don't think it's the only way. I think it will be incredibly powerful to think of other things. I mean, of course, now we think of Black Chicans and Afro-Latinx and so forth. So these are all complex notions in themselves. And that's why, I mean, for me, the hemispheric vision I'm exploring now, this new book on decoloniality, has to do specifically with this connection of the Latin between these two broad colonial terms that need to be used as laboratory for rethinking and decolonizing, basically.
Thank you. It's interesting to pivot from that question and that answer and that decolonial approach to something that's also very much in the minds of people who are committed to Latinx art, and it has to do with the market and collecting. And there's a kind of a lengthy question here, but I'll try my best to read it in its entirety. It says, I'm curious what approach the panelists would take to further the mission of these exhibitions in the commercial gallery space, specifically with regard to living artists. There is still a noticeable lack of Latinx artist representation commercially in New York, not to discount the spaces working hard to counter this. I hesitate to diverge from the nonprofit institutional focus here, but I wonder how a collective push collaboratively between museums and galleries could amplify the mission in a different way, introducing it even wider into private collections. I would love to hear your thoughts on this coming from an institutional perspective, maybe touching on the current surge in representation / amplification and regrettably commodification of Black artists' voices in galleries. Could this be a model or / potential problems as it come with for artists?
I'd like to maybe take a stab at that.
Perfect.
So that's something that I think a lot about. And I'm really going to talk more about non-photographers, but I'll just say one thing about photography. Several years ago, I did a study of APAD, the Photographers Association, the most prestigious galleries. And I literally counted every artist, every photographer that was represented by an APAD gallery. This was several years ago. There were maybe about 1,000. I found 6 that I believe were Latinx. So in the world of photography, the situation is really bad. And you know, it's going to take a long time for that change to happen. I hope that the book has some impact. These exhibitions, some new projects that are starting up. But I do find a bigger change in other forms of other media, you know, in painting and installation and works on paper. Just for example, a few years ago, Frieze included in a Latinx section or Latinx Latin American section, and El Museo actually had a gorgeous exhibition, I believe, of all abstract artists at that time. And there are now a couple of galleries in New York that are, I think 2 or 3 that are now dedicated to Latinx art. So, you know, it's going to be interesting to see where the collector base comes from. I mean, I think at least one of these galleries is showing both Latin American and Latinx art. And, you know, only time will tell if you know, these artists are viable on the market. I think they will be. I think one of the sad things is that they become more viable as they become older or as they pass. You know, one of the photographers in my book, Laura Aguilar, people started buying that work after she died. And that, you know, as we all know, that happens quite often. And you see that same dynamic happening with these older Latinx artists who are beginning to show more in the commercial space.
Can I address this? So my feeling is also with the issue of the market, that the market needs to come hand in hand with scholarship, exhibitions, and, you know, so, and we need to kind of start doing that from the moment artists are young, you know, having the experience of radical women, waiting for women to be in the 70s or 80s and probably died even before the opening for them to be recognized. I think this is what cannot continue to happen in the field. You know, we need to follow with the younger generation, medium generation, and the older generation, and sort of all has to happen hand in hand. But I think it needs to be like museums, galleries, us as scholars and curators need to give, you know, make it a priority for this representation to become larger. So then it's impossible to negate and to completely, you know, to just bypass in the way that has been happening. I think it has had to do a lot with invisibility.
Yeah, I'm going to attend to an answer to that question, or a personal thought I have about this, which is that, you know, we are seeing more galleries. There's a new gallery, Ruiz Calderon, Charlie Moffett represents Kenny Rivero. Like many galleries are starting to represent seriously and have in their rosters Latinx artists. And my fear is that sometimes I think once artists become, or Angel Otero, at Lima Mapa, and once they become, standard names in big gallery rosters, they become less Latinx. So does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy that to be Latinx is not to have representation? So we ourselves have to push against that vision and that version of what we have ingrained in our minds, because which for good reason, they haven't been in, part of the market for a very long time. But now that we see movements and changes, we have to incorporate that also into the narrative of Latinx art, that there's more visibility in the market. I want to address a question that Susana has in the chat. It says, thanks to all the panelists, I think it's really interesting to think beyond the life of the exhibition. So other formats like exhibition catalogs, books, and the various resources that DePaul Museum created are so important. I'm wondering how else we as curators can continue to make efforts in these directions amidst other competing duties. And I'll address that question actually to Julie, because I'm sure this is on your mind, as someone who launched this incredible initiative at DPAM, but now you're in a different museum. Does that mean, I'm sure you've thought about this a lot of, do I launch another initiative at the new museum? Or how, I see it as a network or a beast with tentacles. You want to replicate things that have worked for you in a different museum and do them now on the West Coast. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I really see my job now as one of kind of learning and listening about where I am, who's doing the work already here, and how can I connect with them? I think there is great work being done. We can't ignore that great work's been done in this area for decades in many places and organizations. And so finding who the people are who've been doing this work for a long time or recently are excited and interested, and collaborating. I mean, I just think collaboration is the key to combining our efforts and our interests and our resources to amplify this work collectively and together as much as we can. So that's kind of where I am right now, is just listening and learning. And I mean, working with Amalia Mesa Baines, like she is just, her knowledge of history, of the local history, but also more generally, it's incredible, and to learn from someone who's been doing this work in this field for 4 decades, that's who I need to be listening to right now to learn and then strategize and make a plan.
Yeah. And also in a way, I mean, Amalia is someone who has written so much. She was the pre-podcast, pre-initiative, she was already doing her own initiative in many ways, through her art, through her writing, through her speaking. So it's an interesting to think about. Also in regard to the comments at the beginning, the debriefing of the historicity, like let's look at the historicity of our field and find the lessons that are already there. Let's see, there's questions everywhere. A question for Cecilia. How do you think we can address class and racial differences between the fields of Latin American and Latinx art? While the work of Latin American artists has often been welcome in Latinx art space, the inverse has not always been the case. What do you make of this refusal? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. No, I know. That there are indeed many differences. I think there is quite a bit of misunderstanding in terms of how this exchange has happened. For example, between Mexico and the Chicanx art community, when we did research, we found that there was a lot of exchange. The thing is, the exchange didn't happen at the level of institution. And I want to make a differentiation between who are the institutions, museums, university, which we know that have tended to be incredibly closed off to change and to diversity, and who are the individuals on the ground exchanging, partying together and doing sort of exhibitions and so forth. So I think we need to recuperate a little bit that sense of solidarity. And I feel that the distrust has been also on both sides. But I know that this is real because I worked as chief curator in the Museum of Latin American Art, where when it was completely against the idea that there could be Latinx or Chicanx art in it. It was in this mission that when we did Mexele and they discovered that we were including Chicanx art, they told me that that wasn't possible. And I said, okay, I resign, and then I'm going to return the money to the Getty. So it didn't happen. Now they're open to the Chicanx and Latinx community, but there was an enormous resilience. And there is a resilience that has to do with the hierarchy, which is completely colonial. This is part of the coloniality of the system, which we need to unlearn. This sort of separation and conquer and setting people against each other, for me, it has been an institutionalization of a field. When we look back at the history of the 1970s, let's say in New York, and the type of exhibition that happened prior to the institutionalization of multiculturalism, it was a very, very fluid as a situation. There was not such a big distinction between class, race, gender, and so forth. So I feel that we need to percolate these in the institution, so these conversations are possible. I have to confess that as a person that trained in art history in European art and then into Latin American art, I grew up in a Latin American country, and Latin America was invisible to our own history. So the first fight was that. Then when I came to the US, was realizing, oh, wow, there is all this other universe that I didn't know about. So I know what the difficulties are. But I feel that in any way, we need to have specificity. These labels, Latin America, Latinx, are not general labels to stereotype. They're laboratories to decolonize and to bring out specificity. We need to create specificity in this to rescue the differences, but also to flatten up all this kind of differentiation based on colonial notions.
A little bit on that point that you just made, I want to flag a comment on the Q&A and I'll say the name because it's such a, a specific comment by the great artist Karina Aguilera-Skiversky, who says, I really appreciate the discussion around the shared history of Latinx and Latin America. And this is less of a question, but in my own experience, having not grown up in either NYC or California, my connection with my Latin American background is through my direct experience with Ecuador and through my mother. So I think that points to always trying to retain that specificity. And, you know, when we do surveys, and maybe I'll frame this as the last question, to be conscientious of time and make sure that there's a little break before the next panel. When we do surveys, you know, we are in a way, you know, adopting this big container. And when that happens, there's the potential to flatten some histories. I'm trying to frame it as a question too, but you know, and we know that by using these big containers, we're excluding certain people, and that has happened in many exhibitions where there are Afro-Latinx voices that are not represented, or non-binary people are not represented in exhibitions. So kind of as a broad question for all of you, how do you you know, ensure or think about, add that to your own curatorial practice as a methodology to always have in the forefront of your practice, and not, you know, think, well, I'll do it when I do one solo show, or I'll, you know, or this is a box that I need to check when I'm doing a survey show. How do you keep this at the forefront of your curatorial practice?
Well, I'm happy to answer just 1 second. Once I became aware of notions of feminism and exclusion by gender, now whenever I curate an exhibition that is a group show, I count how many women are in the exhibition. And then I count, depending on the type of exhibition it is, you know, I think because we have been trained in a colonial system by excluding certain voices, excluding certain genders, certain perspectives, we need to, you know, create a discipline where we literally count the numbers. I mean, it sounds awful, but I mean, it's like, if men are more visible, if white people are more visible, then, you know, how are the, you know, if you only rely on that, then you have to just rely on other ways of actually creating justice in the way you curate. I think it's is literally a discipline that slowly becomes embedded, and I think it has to be a priority overall across the board. I don't think there is a black and white answer here. It's, it's not, you can't just be gray. It has to be either you do it and you take it on as a commitment, or it's not possible.
I think by just doing it as much as possible, that in some ways then you begin to erase the category, right? So by just doing it, you begin to then make visible the diversity within this very broad amorphous category. And I think that's where at least I'm trying to get to, which is I could have 2 years of nonstop, Latinx programming, and it would all be very different. It would be the kind of heterogeneity within is where I'm really trying to open up that space, so that it's just, you have intention and you have purpose and focus in some ways, but then within that you have to be very expansive and really inclusive, and make space for the complexities of what this broad term Latinx can embody.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. Just to say just a bit about BRIC. I mean, our whole mission as a nonprofit arts presenting organization is to be inclusive, to break down walls, to give opportunities to artists who wouldn't otherwise have them. So that's really in our DNA. That's what we do. However, even with that, I find that we always still have to challenge ourselves, and there's always more to learn. I find that a lot of times I'm led by the artists. The artists let me know what needs to be done. And, so we do present our artists, from many disciplines, from many ethnicities, but it's challenging. There's only so many exhibitions that we do each year. And so I just feel like there's just incredible more to be done. And, so even an organization like BRIC, I feel like we don't do enough, even though that is our mission.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, to the speakers, to everyone at Museo, Christian, Clara, Helena, and obviously the curator, Susana, Elia, and Rodrigo. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's 3:37. I believe at 3:40, the next panel starts. So come back again in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hola todos. My name is Vivian Crockett, soon to be curator of contemporary art at the New Museum. I'm speaking to you today from the place known as Dallas, Texas, located on the ancestral territories of the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Coushatta, Tonkawa, Wichita, and their affiliates, the Kichi, Waco, and Tawakoni. I'm sharing virtual space today with Dr. Ariana Curtis, Nugent Smith, and Vic Quesada, who I'll introduce shortly. For those just joining El Simposio, a reminder that Colectivo Babilla is offering live Spanish interpretation for this event. One can choose this option by clicking the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. An option for English closed captions is also available via the live transcript button. La TRIENAL has set an important example of the plurality, multiplicity, and porousness of the framework of Latinidad that seeks to reconsider and reimagine the institutional history of El Museo. The concept of diaspora is part of the originary framework of El Museo, and I hope we have some time to reflect on the conceptual possibilities as well as the challenges of diaspora frameworks. ESTAMOS BIEN, and hopefully this panel, affirm the need to go beyond the Hispanophone framework to include often overlooked histories of the Caribbean and the Americas. So Elia Alba actually held a virtual version of her supper club, which is transcribed in the catalog for the exhibition. I highly recommend it. In the conversation, Elia describes Latinx not as an identity, but as a destination or as a meeting point. Vic Quesada, who we'll hear from, characterizes Latinidad as a site of possibility and of unification. Meanwhile, artists like Dom Duroso and Yolaine Rodriguez express an ambivalence with the term. Who does it exclude? Who does it sideline? And there are many who rightfully question the limitations of unifying under the umbrella term Latinidad. ¿Estamos bien de verdad? I want to name my appreciation for the specificity of the space held by this panel, but also want to think about how we as curators, as scholars, as cultural producers, as institutions can center Indigenous and Black knowledge in all spaces and conversations where Latinidad is summoned. These types of panels are important, but also risk reinscribing the separations and the distinctions that have defined many mainstream and institutional conversations on Latinidad. I want to see Black and Indigenous people, queer people, trans people, disabled people on every panel, ideally, having to do with the themes of Latinidad, and that is not always, unfortunately, the case. Ariana shared a comment during our tech run earlier this week that really stuck with me regarding the limits of the term Afro-Latinx, emphasizing the need to not hyphenate ourselves in our experiences. And she said very aptly and beautifully, your Latinidad is not separate from mine. So in the context of this panel, I also wanted to shout out the work of Alan Pelas Lopez, who writes under the handle @MigrantScribble, whose writing and knowledge helps expand and inform my own thinking on these themes. And I wanted to read some of the tweets they shared last week to mark so-called Latinx Heritage Month. And I'll note that these were shared before the xenophobic and anti-Black violence against Haitian asylum seekers at the border of Del Rio, Texas this past week. And I think they have even stronger resonances in this particular context that I really want to also bring into the space and not sideline in the context of this conversation. So I'll share a few of these. For Latinx Heritage Month, who is talking about the descendants of enslaved Black people in South America who fled to the Caribbean islands and are no longer considered to be Latinx, although their genealogical family tree is primarily in the connected South American countries? For Latinx Heritage Month, who is talking about the descendants of Chinese indentured servants in Latin America, specifically Cuba, a landscape that in the 1800s had about 100,000 Chinese forced laborers in the island, many who died in sugar plantations? For Latinx Heritage Month, who is speaking about the impact of Haiti, not only in the Caribbean, but in the Americas at large? Who is doing tributes to Haitian resistance, epistemological approaches to Black freedom, and the radical Haitian imagination? Really important questions, I think, to think about in this conversation. With all of that said, I'm so grateful and honored to be witness to and part of this conversation with each of you who all do so much to expand these conversations, to expand the dialogues we're having, and to highlight often overlooked and underexamined histories. So I'll share very, very abridged versions of each of the speakers' bios, and we'll encourage all of you to spend more time learning about each of their incredible practices. So Dr. Ariana Curtis is the inaugural director of content for Our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past, the Smithsonian's national initiative exploring the history and legacy of race and systemic racism. She's also the first curator of Latinx studies at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Nugent Smith is a first-generation Caribbean American interdisciplinary artist based in Jersey City, New Jersey. Through performance, found object sculpture, mixed media, drawing, painting, video, photo, and writing, Nugent deepens his knowledge of historical and present-day conditions of Black African descendants in the diaspora. Trauma, spiritual practices, language, violence, memory, architecture, landscape, and climate change are primary concerns in his practice. Vic Quesada's work explores liberation through an approach that is rooted in queer and Uto-Aztec indigenous knowledge, histories, and aesthetics. They work with a variety of mediums: performance, video, sculpture, and ceramics. In queering the archaeological, Quesada desires to create an alternate world of erotic power and transformation. So without further ado, I'll pass on the speaking baton to Dr. Ariana Curtis and look forward to the conversation we'll have after each of their presentations.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction that you provided, the context that you're giving to this panel. As I get my life together to share my screen, I just want to, first of all, thank you for inviting me here and say, before I jump into my presentation, I just want to acknowledge that who I am personally, how I identify as African American and Black Panamanian, and the work that I do as an anthropologist who collects art, history, and culture, this institution has always embraced me fully, as well as the broader group convened here. And so I just really wanted to start with that and say how honored I am to share space with you all. So here we go with my PowerPoint. Great. So I wanted to just start us off in this panel about unfolding intersectionality with an understanding of what is intersectionality. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's coined the term, talks about it as a lens, a prism for seeing the ways in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. Intersectionality is simply about how certain aspects of who you are will increase your access to the good things or your exposure to the bad things in life. So basically to say that all of our identities, they interact together, they operate together at the same time, all of the time. We don't necessarily articulate them all at once or even name them, particularly when we feel it's not safe to do so. And so in this presentation today, I really wanted to talk about intersectional work in different contexts. I want to address the changing context of my intersectional approach, even though I have worked at the same institution for almost 9 years. Intersectional work does not look the same everywhere. And specifically with my approach to intersectionality in relation to my own practice, I would like us to talk about museum contexts, spaces of belonging, and power. I started my Smithsonian career at the Anacostia Community Museum, which was founded in 1967 as part of the Black Museum movement in the United States. It is a DC-focused community museum located in a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Southeast DC. So at the time that I joined the staff in 2013, Anacostia was redefining their institutional identity in the face of a new national African-American museum for the Smithsonian that had just broken ground and amid a rapidly gentrifying Washington, DC. And especially when I was at Anacostia, and I wanted to start here because El Museo was undergoing similar institutional identity challenges, and I really looked to them as a sister museum more so than the national museums on the mall. So what does it mean to be a Latino in a place with few Latinos? Latinx studies was brand new to the Anacostia Community Museum. I was the first curator for Latino studies. There were no preconceived notions or institutional histories to contend with, which was both an opportunity and a challenge. I had a blank slate, and I saw my work as twofold. One, to reinterpret existing collections. Stuart Hall has this wonderful quote about people claiming identities as they become historically available. And I think that is so true for museums, especially in terms of cataloging and labels. And my second challenge was to complicate and diversify how the museum represented Washington, D.C., specifically inserting Latinx narratives into other DC narratives, like DC is a queer-friendly space, DC is Chocolate City, DC as a transient space and home to generations of Washingtonians, and DC as local versus Washington as a federal space. So place was really my context at Anacostia, Washington, DC specifically. And an intersectional approach helped make visible the historical and contemporary uniqueness of this place and the people who have called this place home. It also prioritizes the specificity that we know is lost in mainstream museums that often disregard our intergroup differences. And it's not just about the identities presented, but also how they are displayed and interpreted. Our museum contexts matter. So there was a moment at the museum where all 3 exhibition spaces were bilingual and Latinx focused. I actually saw Latinx visitors cry as they experienced what they called a representative and inclusive space. And as curator, that was very powerful for me. I'm also glad that I saw this card because my exhibitions at Anacostia in 2016 were the first at the Smithsonian to use the term Latinx, which wasn't a super popular decision at the time. But the card reads, "Thank you for having a beautiful museum that represented my culture and struggles. More people need to know about the Latinx community, and we will not be silenced." And so this really did change Anacostia as a space of belonging for a larger DC community. I currently work as curator for Latinx Studies at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Today is actually our 5th anniversary. And so I believe that I'm the only curatorial position for Latinx Studies at an African American museum, and we are all really proud of that. So US African Americanness is the museum context, but I also joined in the context of institution building. I joined the staff when the museum was 3 months old, and we all wanted to set a bold, expansive, intersectional foundation for what a 21st century museum could look like. I had time to learn the collection and think through what Latinidad through an African American lens, locally, nationally, and globally could look like. So this boat seat from Esmeraldas, Ecuador, which was a maroon community, a community based in Black freedom, with the etchings representing a Nancy spider, was the very first object donated to our museum. So I joined a team with an existing intellectual and material foundation for Latin American, Andean, African diasporic, and African American connections. This is how I have organized my collecting areas as curator for Latinx Studies at an African American museum. I know there are people who are uncomfortable with my representation of Latinidad, and that is the exact reason that I insisted on the title Latinx Studies, not Afro-Latinx Studies. As Vivian said, your Latinidad is not separate from mine. I want us to share language. I want us to use the same terminologies because our histories and cultures are connected. I had the privilege to choose my title. I have the privilege to center Blackness in my work. And because I work at an institution whose name is currency, these choices have power. I hope it validates or models intersectional intention and praxis far beyond the walls of our DC-based museums. That power, that institutional influence that comes with my job is important to name. Our frameworks matter. So what does Latinx Studies collections look like? So our Latinx Collections portal is a way to visually share what is Latinx Studies at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so if I included just a few screen grabs here, I certainly encourage you to visit in all of my bios. But I wanted to share at least one publicly accessible example of how I approach and share intersectionality in my curatorial work. For the past year, race has been my primary lens. At the invitation of the first Black secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie Bunch, I serve as director of content for a Smithsonian-wide initiative about race and systemic racism. The Smithsonian is 175 years old. It is a predominantly white space, and this is a huge context shift for me. I come to this new job from Black-centered, Latinx inclusive museum spaces. And so it's through that lens that I was able to lead the creation of a value statement. And I certainly don't expect you to read all of the text on the screen. But these are excerpts from a full-page statement, the heart of which is that we believe in intersectional justice work. And the we that it refers to is the entire Smithsonian Institution. So because of where I sit now, these belief statements apply to 19 museums, 11 centers, and a zoo. And I hope that it gives confirmation or permission or cover for scholars, interns, artists, future museum professionals, and other organizations committed to intersectional justice work. And this is far beyond diverse staffing. When we're talking about museums, we're talking about praxis. We're talking about collecting and cataloging and interpretation and display and audience building and collaborations. And these belief statements originated in the marginal sections of our institution and now have a full institutional backing, which is a reminder that our frameworks are powerful. And so returning to El Museo in the context of Latinidad, when I think about intersectionality and curatorial intention in this show, the geographic reach is greater than it has been. The artists are almost entirely new to your space. The material diversity, the vulnerability, the break from Latinidad having to have a Hispanic center. These are our stories, and these are the conversations and tensions that should be public. We don't want to suppress our specificity or our differences in the name of a disingenuous Latinx unity. This show to me felt like community-centered and community-responsive work. And in the context of place, for Latinx art, New York has a spotlight. So at a moment where museums are looking hyper-local, where museums are saying less is more, you went national and you said more is more. And you used your institutional power to expand the concept of we and create safer spaces for the identities that have been marginalized within Latinx art. As Smithsonian is in the early conception of a Museum of the American Latino, your exhibition makes me think of a Toni Morrison quote, where she said, "I stood at the border, I stood at the edge and claimed it as central and let the rest of the world move over to where I was." So this is the intersectional, inclusive standard by which we will measure future shows at El Museo and beyond. This has and will continue to change individual and collective understandings of Latinx artists, Latinx art, and the social value of museums. So in closing, I just wanted to say that I'm really excited for the precedent that this is and for the legacy that it will create. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana. I'll pass on the mic to Nujan, I think is next.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I just have to preface this by saying that in this era of doing these types of panels and stuff on Zoom, sometimes you run into construction. So unfortunately, outside my window, there's a little bit of construction happening. So hopefully it's not too disruptive, but just wanted to acknowledge that. I would like to also acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from Jersey City, New Jersey, which is indigenous Lenape people, the land of the Lenape people here in Jersey City in this area. I am really excited to be here today, really thankful for the entire El Museo curatorial staff for including me in this exhibition. And it's been a wonderful opportunity to just kind of engage with so many of the other artists that I respect that are in this show and continue to have these types of dialogues with everyone who's involved in this panel and this entire symposium. Here. So I'd like to just start by saying that the work that I'm doing is I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I am working in found object sculpture, mixed media drawings, performance, and video, and also in thinking a lot about language as part of my practice. Okay, so I'm unfortunately gonna have to just switch over here. This is giving me a little issue. Excuse me one moment. Yeah, my apologies, everyone here. I am experiencing some issue that just popped up here. I don't know why this is happening. Can we move on to the next presenter and I can join back in? Sorry
Yeah,
about
that
that.
sounds like a plan. Vic, if you don't mind presenting next, and we'll just switch up the order.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I just, I want to thank the curators, and I want to thank everybody who put this together and made it possible. My name is Vic Quesada. I go by they, them. Currently, I'm occupying Nipmuc Pocumtuck land in Western Massachusetts, far from home, which is El Paso, Texas. Polvos town, land of the Tigua Pueblo. Today what I wanted to do is I kind of wanted to cover 3 topics, and what they'll do is sort of like be intentional, and then they'll set up like talking about my practice, but it all is interrelational. So similar to what an earlier panelist was discussing, actually Ariana, I wanted to talk about intersectionality, and I wanted to kind of be like really clear about like what it is and what it means. And Kimberly Crenshaw actually defined intersectionality, coined this word, meaning how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another, and then they overlap. So the concept intersectionality has gone viral over in the past half decade. So it's resulting is in a backlash from the right and also critical-minded academics and activists. So I'm interested in thinking about intersectionality from the approach that Jennifer Nash takes, who is a Black scholar. And she talks about this in Black Feminisms Reimagined, and she shows how intersectionality has been co-opted amongst others, right? And as well as she makes further claims. But in Nash's book, she includes different outlooks on intersectionality. Some of the claims are that intersectionality is imperative to activism, it's a unifier, and it has a political agenda. Where in another way that somebody is talking about it, and this is in quotes, is the latest academic craze is in the American Academy, and it's likened to religion, one that's dangerous and through which all speech must be filtered. So the use of the phrase intersectional has become packaged in such a way that it becomes corporatized, and it can be whitewashed. So using the word intersectionality involves a more critical and nuanced read. At the heart of intersectionality is Black women's intellectual labor. Intersectionality has become co-opted by liberal language and can conflate the experience of oppression that Black, Brown, POC, trans, and women migrants experience in comparison to others who are more privileged but also face oppression. Which actually brings me to Jimé's work. Jimé was in La TRIENAL, and Jimé's work captures It's photography. Let me actually, I'm gonna go ahead and share that. I just kind of realized that I wasn't sharing my screen, so give me a second. Let's see, sorry about that. Let's see. Okay, so this is the actual book that I was talking about of written by Jennifer Nash. And this is Hime, who captures the essence of queers and trans people of colors at intersecting points. On Hime's webpage, when I entered, it was like I was visiting the house of Hime Izquierdo Ugas, and it was an experience that was of senses that were grounded in sight, sound, and a poetic of text. So these works give marginalized queer bodies, loved ones, individuality, and agency. Uga's works demonstrates what queer kinship looks like. Queer kinship is groups of oppressed sex, gender, race, disability, and class coming together, and then they form community and family. These families contrast what Western family narratives and imagery that are invested with procreating and continuing the family name and narrow-minded, heteronormative, puritanical white sensibilities. The movement and family bonds create solidarity, and it actually creates room for transformation. So all of that to say is what brings me to my own work. This is Hime's work, but this is my actual work right here. In my own work, I too am in dialogue with the community, and it's informed by cultural and political context. My art works started primarily with photography. From 2011 to 2015, I began photographing political demonstrations and gay pride parades in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Los Angeles, El Paso, New York City. In 2015, I began a body of work called T-Series that documented 9 transgender people who were living in Los Angeles, and that were also, many of them are my friends. These photographs captured liminal bodies, people who are blurring the boundaries of national belonging and resisting the structures of the gender binary. This series included Sabal, who it was here. I don't know if any of you know about Los Angeles. These are the callejones in Santee Alley where you can buy all the name brand fashion. And then there was Mia. Mia and I also played basketball on a basketball league. And then there's Bambi, which Bambi is actually an activist in Los Angeles, a prolific activist, and has really shaped what it means to be trans and living within the margins. So this is sort of the work that I began creating. And then in 2015, my work started shifting. I actually went into an MFA program. So my practice began to integrate art, like archival work, of my own experiential research, adding a layer of thinking and abstraction to my work. During my graduate studies, I expanded into sculpture and performance, making works that mirrored the dynamic energies found at political demonstrations. In my first group, and it encapsulated the nuanced struggles of queer and indigenous and transgender people. I'm going on to the next. In 2016, I started doing a lot more research. So a response to documenting people's lives is like basically turn the gaze on myself. And I created this video, which was titled High Grind, Low Wage, which art historian Salas describes the scene as where Quesada appears with a lawnmower and a large expansive field of manicured grass. The video commences with a pull of a lawnmower cord. Several minutes later, I come into the scope of the green, hold on, I'm sorry, I'm reading this. I come into the scope of the green grass, pushing a red lawnmower, wearing blue Dickies pants and an A-shirt commonly known as a wife beater. Standing within invisible grid lines, I rhythmically and repetitiously move forward and backward, mowing the expansive land. Writer Patrick Gauguin describes the piece. The frame swells with vast stretch of green, calling the mind a golf course or posh Long Island lawn, with the viewer positioned slightly above as it is from a country club terrace. In 2016 to 2018, I worked on a project that involved building a fleet of shopping carts, an endeavor largely inspired by Rascache engineering, an indigenous Latinx survival practice of transforming everyday objects from one's immediate surrounding. Shopping cart number 1 is a mobile greenhouse illuminated with neon purple lights and lush green stalks of corn growing from a mound of earth within the cart's basket. The shopping cart steel mesh frame is spray painted gold chrome and adorned with a gold metal metallic tape deck boombox secured at the helm. I wove recycled cotton t-shirt strips into the body of the cart's basket. Weaving is an ancient practice of the Mexica who spun their blankets and clothing from plant fibers. In the spring of 2021, living in the pandemic and a plethora, I love the word plethora, of research galvanized into a body of ceramic sculpture work grounded in Rascache aesthetics. Anthropocene Teen featured a ceramic figure 6 by 5 by 7, dressed in a traditional Mexica indigenous clothing while standing on a concrete road atop a cubed block of earthen soil. Kate McQuaid, an art writer for the Boston Globe, writes the figurative sculpture with a dinosaur head was a hybrid indigenous Aztec dinosaur. The piece references geologic epochs in which mass extinctions occurred due to natural disasters or genocide. These works reference the current moment we are living in, a global pandemic caused by hyperglobalization and imperialism. Ironically, or not, 500 years ago, Aztec indigenous people dealt with a smallpox outbreak that wiped out the entire civilization and caused mass extinction on Earth. So that's basically rounding up some of the work that I've created over the course of time, and how you can see like it evolving. Most recent, what I'm doing is I'm adjuncting at studio art at UMass, and I'm currently working on two performance pieces and 2 sculpture works. So that's what I have to say today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Vic. I'm wondering if we are good to go with Eugen's PowerPoint. I think we're gonna have it queued up from the El Museo side.
What are we looking at time? How much time do I have left?
We want to give you your full time, boo. We'll readjust as needed.
All right, thank you so much.
Of course.
So thank you all, everyone, for your patience. Thank you so much, Vic, for jumping in there. I appreciate it. I would like to start with this image here. This image is a photograph of our family living room or drawing room, as we would call it in Trinidad. And this is a place where I had my formative years, and so much about who I am now and the work that I make was formed here in this space. And there is a poet, a dub poet, Jamaican dub poet by the name of Muta Baruka. And one of his poems that I heard on, I don't remember whether it was on television or whether it was on the radio at a very young age. I probably was about 6 or 7 years old. And I heard this poem, and it goes, a part of it goes, every time I hear the sound, the sound, the sound, the sound, the sound that is not my name. Mr. Brown, Mr. Right, Mr. White have no right. Cha. And it was the first time that I heard someone kind of evoke this kind of ideas about one's belonging and who has the right to rule over or control another individual, and as very specifically as it related to race. Those ideas and that experience was then compounded by other music that I was hearing in our home and other, like in the neighborhood and other family homes. A lot of reggae music, words of Bob Marley and Peter Tosh. And I believe that that's when I started to really think about the impact and what music can do as it relates to this idea of fighting back against a system of oppression. So this place is where I heard the sound and what has moved me to be the person and the artist that I am today. Next slide, please. Conceptual maps is a important part of my work, part of my Bundle House series. And these conceptual maps is a way for me to explore ideas about intersectionality as it relates to people moving from one place to another, people who are brought together by a particular set of circumstances or an event or events. This map that we're looking at here, Bundle House Borderlines number 4, Saint Maricotin, is actually a hybrid island that's made up of the shape of the island of Saint Martin, both the French and the Dutch sides, as well as Puerto Rico. So I merged the shape of these landscapes together to come up with this new landscape. And this was in response to Hurricane Maria in 2017. So thinking about Caribbean islands that were devastated by that particular hurricane. And the way that I was looking at it as here are two different spaces, different languages are being spoken, different sets of customs and cultures, yet they're bound together through this particular event. These works here, these map works also contain thread sewing that creates borders in between the spaces within this particular landscape. And I'm thinking about these borders as places of futility, borders being the futility of borders, the fragile nature of borders, borders as construct of the way that colonialism had kind of divided spaces or brought spaces together that may have traditionally been at odds with one another. So this idea of the borders being this imaginary spaces between spaces. And as I think about this idea of borders and as it relates to the maps that I make, the Borderline series that I'm making, next slide, please. We come to where we are today in thinking about, and what was mentioned in the introduction about what is happening on the border right now with Haitian migrants. And being half Haitian, I'm half Trinidadian, half Haitian, I have been really just grappling with lots of emotions, lots of thoughts and feelings and ideas, of course, as it relates to what is going on there at the moment. And it reminded me of this work, which is still a work in progress, called Behold Your Horse. And this performance was conceived in thinking about this idea of that in Haitian voodoo, they say that when one is possessed by the spirit, you become mounted by the spirit and you become the horse for the spirit. And this performance, I am the spirit, I am the horse, I am myself, all in one throughout this performance itself. And as I started to think about what is going on at the border with Haitian migrants specifically, I couldn't help but think about that idea of the radical Haitian imagination, the history of that. And when we as a people are going through or have gone through major traumatic events, the ritual, the folklore, the storytelling, the myths, the other kind of spiritual practices that come together to help us to cope with the moment in time or the experience or the event that we're experiencing. And I couldn't help but think about many of the Haitian migrants that are possibly also voodoo practitioners. And what does it mean to see a horse confronting you as you are trying to enter into this space to create a new life for yourself. So I'm now kind of processing that and kind of thinking about that through my own creative lenses and how I can kind of work through that, help me to process, help me to cope as well, but and also for the possibility of creating new work, and also for the possibility of bringing that into this very particular performance to further contextualize this as a performance created within our time. The next slide, please. Much of the work that I do, that I've done over the last 3 years as it relates to performance, has been done throughout the Caribbean. So I've been traveling through the Caribbean, doing my own academic research as well as experiential research and making work. And this is a performance that was that I made in Martinique in 2017, where I had this flag constructed, and this flag is constructed from madras fabric, which has its own history, very particular history in Martinique. And I was there to really learn about this and do research on this and meet with people to discuss this particular fabric. And I wanted to look at this in this performance and creating this flag, look at this as a Pan-African struggle and as a shared Pan-African experience. And so this flag, I chose the red, black, and green madras to construct this flag, to think about those particular ideas and how it relates to language in Martinique, how it relates to the history of colorism there in Martinique, as well as a few other things that are compounded and layered on top of this performance. But one of the things about this performance is that's really important for me, and I always want to share this, is this freedom that exists within the running of the flag. And this freedom, as I think about it, is part and parcel as it relates to myself as an artist in the exploration of all of these intersectionalities, and the freedom that I feel and that I have, and the power in that to be able to explore these ideas. So the running with this flag is really symbolic as it relates to this idea of freedom and autonomy within these spaces. And the last slide, please. This is a project that has just recently been completed. It's a full-length LP in collaboration with my brother, who does all the digital production, music production on this. So this album here was created over the last year and a half in responding to our current time and thinking about all of the racial unrest that has been happening, not only here in the United States, but across the world, and in very particular ways within the Caribbean and places that we may also consider as like Latinx spaces and places where we're having these conversations. And this music itself is rooted in hip hop, which has such a foundation that is absolutely connected to people from the Caribbean, who were pioneers in this particular creative art form. And so the music is rooted in that, but in hip hop, but also taps into the rhythms of the Caribbean. And so this is a kind of a capsule of encapsulation of our time. It reflects back on the past as well as opens up opportunities for the future. And this is a new project which will be launched in November, and we have the pre-sale that begins for this particular box set and album in October 1st. And in this, as part of this project, there has been a collaboration. We spoke about collaboration here during the talk already, and this idea of collaboration amongst other people from the diaspora to bring together, to bring forth this message. All right, thank you very much.
Amazing, thank you so much. Now we have lots of time for discussion. I want to invite people who are witnessing this to share some questions for us to think through together. I think people are quite shy with this panel. I don't see many questions coming in, so feel free to send them through. I think all of you have touched on, some aspects of the first question I had. But, this comment that Ariana made, summoning Stuart Hall, this idea that, claiming identities is also about when terms become historically available and they help us reflect on, new ways of naming ourselves and naming our experiences. So I did want to spend some time asking each of you, how you relate to the term Latinx. I think it's come up to some degree in your presentations, and I really appreciate the grounding of this conversation in intersectionality as well, and its roots and its origins and its centrality to Black women's intellectual and emotional labor. But I'm curious how contemporary discourses, current conversations inform your approach to your work. I think, as I said, many of you have already touched on this, but if there's anything you'd want to expand around those questions. Whatever order y'all want to go in, it's for all of you, so.
I can start to break the silence and say that, it's an interesting question for me because I, for a long time, really tried to keep my personal out of my professional, because I felt that so often it was always people of color who had to identify themselves in spaces and make that direct relationship to the work that we do, or at the very worst, that our work is reduced to our lived experiences. And so for a while I said, no, I'm not going to tell you how I identify. What's important, right, is this curatorial aims that, that I'm talking to you about. And I've really softened about that, just recognizing that how I articulate myself is really important, and it's important and it's instructive for the people who we share space with and who we're in community with. And so me, as someone who is African-American and Black Panamanian, growing up in a Black affirming household, I didn't think twice about that identity at all. I'm actually from where Vic currently is, Western Massachusetts, which is pretty densely Puerto Rican, and so as the Caribbean person that I feel my Panamanianness is, it didn't feel foreign until I went to North Carolina. And then all of a sudden it was just like, how are you Black? Like, are you Latina? Like, does that make sense? What does that mean? Someone actually asked me once where Panamania was. And I was like, well, the country's called Panama, but being able to have those lived experience has informed my curatorial practice so much that when I went to Anacostia and doing this, revisiting the collection, Anacostia was born of the Black Museum movement, where Black was the terminology then. And so many people were using Black as a synonym for African-American, and thinking that I was coming in to do work that was different. But that practice of, revisiting the collection, I was just like, wow, look at all of these Afro-Latinx artists that you have collected from. And one of the exhibitions that we did was actually about Derek Webster, who's a found object artist who was born in Honduras and raised in Belize, right? But he was classified as a Black artist. And I was just like, I'm not saying that he's not African-American, but all of these sculptures are carnival, which does not resonate with the Chicago Black artist for me, so let's interrogate this. And so I think, being able to have these open conversations and make us publicly accountable to how the community defines themselves vis-a-vis the collections that we have, the labels that we put forward in our museum spaces, and just what our curatorial intentions are. But I think that is so often led by people of color. And so I just, really want to give us kudos for having that bravery and that vulnerability to say, this is who we are, and this is why it matters.
I started really thinking about this idea of when you spoke about the kind of tension that exists as we come up with have these names like Latinx. The tension for me began to arise when I started to think about, well, is there going to be another category that's going to be invented at another point in time, where then in a way, is it, I have to make a decision, I think, on where do I activate my energies? Where do I put my energy in the sense of, as an example, being considered Latinx. And then there was a book that was published on Latinx artists. And I was like, oh, so I started to look through this. I'm starting to look for, one is like, I'm looking for my name, because I want to see if I'm included in these, list of artists that are Latinx, because now I've found out what the definition is. And it's like, oh yes, I do fit in that. So let's see if I'm included in this list of artists. And it's like, no, you're not, I'm not included in that. And it's like, oh, so now it becomes this other space, essentially, where I am now kind of concerned about whether I'm included or excluded. And so, although I do think that there is a value in having these types of terms and this very specific term, Latinx, I do understand the kind of feeling of the ambivalence with, and I do experience that ambivalence as well. So also too, if I'm walking through an exhibition that's Latinx artists, I'm now looking for that, those other people that look like me within this context. And when I don't see that, then I start to ask more questions about this idea of who is sitting at the table, who's doing the inclusion and the excluding, making those decisions as well. So I think it is even though it has its up and down, its upsides, I also think it's problematic.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that, of how Latinx is actually, it conflates identity, right? And then sort of it flattens everything out. But I mean, I think that that's really important to think about. And I do know that there are people that are constantly pushing against that and are refusing it, which is like completely up to the way that they want to identify, and that's okay too. But I think for me, words give us power to understand things, right? And I think that words are political. So I think the phrase Latinx is actually, it's a political tactic. And there's this like phrase that I think we're all on that same wavelength, because I actually wanted to share a Stuart Hall quote with y'all earlier, but I ran out of time. But there is this quote that Stuart Hall says, I'll just go ahead and read it. It says, "Power and representation is that it's not going to be true, and that tomorrow it is, in some way, going to make slightly different sense of it, meaning it's going to come out of the fixing and begin to loosen and fray. The fraying and the loosening requires a determination to exist, to dream, and create a new consciousness." So what I think that the word Latinx for me means is it's like creating a new consciousness. It's a political agenda. It's pushing and it's unifying so that we can get to the next step, so that we can get to that loosening and fraying to where each of and I it's unfortunate. It really is. I mean, I think that all of us wish we would be able to have that stage, but unfortunately, you know, whiteness is everywhere and empowering. So you know, there's just these creative strategies to sort of be represented in equitable ways. So that's sort of my thought on that.
I really appreciate that reminder, Vic, because, you know, in your presentation, you also foregrounded the way that intersectionality, for example, became this mainstream phenomenon that lost sight of the real activism and the organizing and the larger, you know, framework out of which it was born. And Latinx is really similar. I mean, I was having conversations, you know, with my family. At first it was the @ sign, you know, that we used for a while, and then the X came about. But these are conversations that we've been having long before, you know, Latinx is on the cover of Vanity Fair with Selena Gomez as, you know, a whitewashed Marilyn Monroe. Like, these are conversations that have specific roots, and it's important to really think about that and think about it as a political strategy. I didn't want to spend some time. There are some great questions here that I hope to get to, but I did want to ask if, I know Nujan, you talked a little bit about your work that's in the exhibition Estamos Bien, but I wanted to hear a little bit more specifically about Borderlines #6, and then Vic, Tabled Remains, if you could speak about those. And I think I love the pairing of both of you on this panel, because I think both of you really use and reinterpret found objects and found materials in your work in a very tactical way that really brings about specific histories and really helps us to interrogate, you know, questions of land and borders and cartographies, and I think is part of a larger context for your work that I would love to talk about in the context of La Trienal in particular. And Ariana, as a curator who's also on this call, if you have anything to add about their work and the ways that you feel it resonates, I would love to hear that as well.
Yeah, so in Borderlines #6, Emembe, I call it Imembe because of the Dajabon massacre, and where many under the dictatorship of Trujillo in Dominican Republic, many Haitians were massacred along in the area of the Dajabon area, the Dajabon River. And there was the folklore is that some of the Dominican soldiers were able to tell who was Haitian by asking them to say perejil, which is cilantro, oh no, parsley. They were asking them to say this word, and because of a Haitian accent, there would be a difficult, it would be very clear of who's Haitian or who's not. Of course, that's problematic because many Haitians that live along the border there, sometimes you can't tell when they're speaking Spanish that they're actually Haitian. But anyway, this piece in Membe, what I wanted to remember that event. And so by leaving out the R's from the word remember in the beginning of the word remember and eliminating the R from the end of the word remember, you end up with Imembe. And so because the R is the thing that gave them away, the pronunciation of the R is the thing that gave them away. So I wanted to eliminate that. And so this piece, when I began this piece, I printed out the map of the island itself, and IT, which is originally known as. I left it in my studio and I came in and it was facing me 90 degrees clockwise. So when I looked at the map in that direction, it looked like a figure running across the water. And so immediately I thought about, and in the way that this figure appears to me, when I looked at the formation of that map, it looked like the person was cloaked. So I thought about Egungun, the sacred masquerade, where the entire body is cloaked. And then as I thought about that, I thought about the descendants of the ancestors of Haitians, many of them, the region where they were coming, and I started to think about the spiritual practices that came from there. And then it brought me back to the Loas, which are the deities, the four Haitian voodoo practitioners. And so I decided that this figure was going to be a new Loa, and for the entire island, and especially for the persecution that the Haitians faced. So I thought about this as a new Loa for reparative justice, for reparations, as examples of what this new Loa stands for. And so there's like different types of symbols within this map itself. There's also a direct homage to the art of sewing voodoo flags with sequins. So I'm using sequins in this map to also pay homage to this tradition of creating these flags. So this work of art is a codex, as well as offering a new kind of perspective on the history of this space.
Okay, I'm next. Okay. So in Table Remains, which is currently on view in El Museo, it's actually a social commentary on the role that institutions have in reinforcing and in reproducing values through disciplinary practices. These plastic trays, these are just like models of the plastic trays. The actual plastic trays themselves can be seen in prisons, can be seen in hospitals, can be seen in daycares and in various institutional locations. So I'm looking primarily at at the Americas and the practices of like Christianity and Catholicism and how it was used to assimilate people, indigenous people in the Americas, and specifically I think that I'm influenced by the borderlands of El Paso and Juarez. There's a stretch of about 9 miles, and there are Catholic missions. There's about 4 of them, and these Catholic missions were set up as sites of like to create like power and dominance, right? Like in these missions, it was worked as like a colonial government of Spain. So these sites, there was schools there. There was also there was like police there, and then there was also troops that would go after indigenous people. And the way that indigenous people were assimilated was through Catholicism. And so there's these trays. This is sort of what the trays, the history has embedded in the trays. But what the trays are doing is it's resisting, there's a resistance or there's a questioning of these systems in the process of the way that I actually made them. And these part of the process was on honoring indigenous traditions of pit firing. So I began to make these, I fired them in a pit. And I didn't have any idea that after I fired them, they were all going to be different colors, and they're very tactile, and the patina had a different hues, which was absolutely like, it was just pretty phenomenal that happened. So that's what this piece is about.
Amazing. Ariana, do you have anything you want to add here?
No, I mean, I was lucky that Susana and Elia took me around the exhibition, and when I was in New York, definitely pointed out Nugent and Vic's work to me. So because we were going to be on this panel together, and they were some of the pieces that I was most taken with as well. So as someone, again, who works in a museum that is history galleries with visual art galleries, sometimes visual art galleries can feel intimidating to our visitors, and I thought that the way in which you both approach your work and the work that is in this exhibition with having this resonance, right, this everyday resonance and maps and trays and things that people could understand and then, reinterpret them through the lenses that you've put forward, I thought was just really beautiful.
Absolutely. So I want to make sure I leave room for at least one question from people who are tuning in. One is, I think is a really good one, from Abigail Lapanda Darshti. She writes, hi everyone, I'm wondering about the question of language in your different projects. For instance, I'm fascinated by Nugent's Master My Language series and his various performances in the French Caribbean as well as English speaking countries. Ariana works at a major US museum with a population representing a population with diverse languages, and Vic with the articulation of indigenous languages. How does translation in languages inform and motivate your work?
Well, I'll go ahead and answer this. I made a piece which was called Seed and Seed, and it was a performance piece that actually where I went to El Paso, Texas, and I spoke about the missions that I walked along, and I was dropping seeds. So in this video performance, I began to craft sort of a poetic about the space and thinking about histories, and in it there was this dialogue that I shared between my grandmother and my mom, and embedded in our language is Nahuatl, which is it's a Uto-Aztec language. Basically, it was spoken across Mexico. So these are just ways that I think that I was using Spanish, English, and Nahuatl. So there's a way that I'm able to sort of weave in and out of these identities and incorporate them into my practice, because they're inherently here. So it works out to where it's weaving in like the complicated ideas of being also a settler, right? And then also having indigeneity, but then like having this like other identity of queerness. So yeah, that's sort of how language plays into my work.
I'll jump in quick in the interest of time and say that it was a bit of a shock for me, honestly, to go from Anacostia as a small community museum. It was expected that the exhibitions that I do at the very least be bilingual, English and Spanish. And so I always had that in mind when I was writing the scripts, right? To make sure that I was not using jargon or things that were going to be difficult to translate into Spanish, or things that just didn't translate well. And so moving to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the museum space in and of itself is English only. And so we do have an app that's English, French, and Spanish, but it was just a shift in thinking about who was coming to that space, what they could see, what they could understand. And as part of the race initiative, this Smithsonian-wide initiative, I appreciate this perspective, right? Because I get to see how different museums do things differently. So our National Portrait Gallery, for example, is English-Spanish bilingual, right, as an institution, not just the Latinx exhibitions, which was always my qualm at Anacostia, right? Like my exhibitions would be bilingual. What about the other curators' exhibitions would just be in English, right? So that consistency of language access for our audiences. But we have a director, Dr. Deborah Mack, for the Race Initiative, who heads our Office of Strategic Partnerships at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And their work is national and international and is already multilingual. And so I'm excited to have someone who already has that perspective about not just multilingual audiences in the United States, but how are we building collaborations and partnerships beyond English speakers as an institution? And so for me, it really has been a shift to just, really focusing on the DC Latinx community, which is largely Spanish speaking, to a national African American museum where some things were in different languages, but not necessarily by policy, to a race initiative that says we are the United States and global, and we need to respond to that language and culture. So it's a shift for me now, that really started with English, Spanish, that is now moving far beyond that.
My work with language, specifically Master My Language, is an ongoing series, and it's one of the series that I really love because of the way that it continues to unfold. And the more that I learn about language, the more that I can apply to continue to complicate this work. And this whole series essentially came from a poem that I wrote about my disconnect from my Haitian ancestry. My mother and father were divorced when I was young, so living with my Trinidadian mother, and growing up in that household, I didn't learn so much about my Haitian side and legacy and all of that. So I wrote this poem about that. And then when I made these strips of text of that poem where where you can read the poem in these vertical strips of rubber, and all of the cutaways in order to get that text, all of the negative spaces started to look like some sort of foreign language to me. And so that spoke to the idea that Creole, Haitian Creole, is a foreign language to me, essentially. So I started to kind of organize them in these kinds of phrases. So using all of the negative spaces to organize these phrases of what would be some sort of fictitious language, but it relates back to my not knowing Haitian Creole. So this work has been unfolding. The works on paper, when I'm looking at them, then I started to imagine, like, what would it be like to hear the sounds. So I started to work with a musician to create a musical notation system for these symbols and these shapes and forms. So I'm creating scores for each one of these works on paper. And now I'm creating these sculptural forms where I'm carving wood in each one of these forms, to start to think about what it means to also add another type of material to language, and further being better in order to better understand what it is that I'm experiencing with language itself.
That's wonderful. I guess I'll add my own, experience as someone. I was born in Brazil. My first language was Portuguese. I learned Spanish in order to be able to access Latinx community in the US. And, on some days my Spanish is better than others. Oftentimes it's just straight up portuñol and I make it work. But I would love to see these spaces, especially in the US, also involve translation to Creole, to Portuguese, to other languages, and to continue to increase access across the board, including also, sign language in various different language iterations, I think is an important thing to think about when we think about access. We are at time. We're a little bit over our time. I want to thank Candida Alvarez for graciously giving us a few more minutes so that we could wrap up with our technical issues. It was wonderful, so wonderful to be in dialogue with all of you, Nugent, Ariana, Vic. I wish we had more time to talk. There's so much more to say, but I hope that this is a beginning of a really important conversation that continues to happen. So excited to see the closing of this panel, and thank you for having us as part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for staying tuned to the Estamos Bien closing symposio on what, at least here in New York, is a really beautiful Friday afternoon. It's my extreme pleasure to be introducing our final speaker of the day, artist Candida Alvarez, who will be delivering the closing remarks. As Elizabeth Ferrer noted earlier, Alvarez is a Brooklyn-born artist whose connection to El Museo actually dates back to the 1970s, where she took part in a number of projects, including the avant-garde exhibition Confrontación in 1977. So especially because of this close connection, we're extremely pleased that she is part of Estamos Bien, of course, whose title, as many of you who have been following the exhibition know by now, was actually inspired by Alvarez's painting, Estoy Bien. Alvarez received a BA from Fordham University and an MFA from the Yale School of Art, and moved to Chicago in the late 1990s, where she's really become a touchstone figure to a whole network of artists, including many of the other artists who are also exhibited in Estamos Bien. As we'll be seeing today, Alvarez is known for her conceptually rich, intuitive process of building abstract patterns. Her work is included in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, among many others. She is the 2021 recipient of the Helen Frankenthaler Award for Painting, and currently lives between Chicago and Baroda, Michigan, where she's coming to us today. So Candida, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susanna. It is a beautiful day in Baroda, I must say. And also, I am so touched about, I just was able to listen to some of the words that were being used just now. And that word collaboration is such a strong one, right? And when you mentioned the 70s in that show, Susanna, all I could think about was, yes, that was when the word collaboration really came close to me, right? That's when I realized that I can participate as a collaborator. So it's still going strong, and I'm really happy to keep hearing it over all these years. So I just want to say, this has been such a long day of sharing, and I'm so honored to have been asked to be here with you today. And it's so great to be in your mix. I mean, really, after so many years of being in this, it's just so nice to be able to bridge ideas and to sort of be in the center of things, and to sort of go back to New York for a bit, and sort of still feel like community is still so alive. And I think for me, one of the things that I've learned is that, community is really something that is at the center of yourself. It's not something, it's something that you have to have. You don't just gain it outside. It's not something outside of you, it's always inside of you. So I just wanted to share that. And I'm going to be showing a PowerPoint today. It's a new one for me. I'm showing some new work. I'm sharing some new ideas that I haven't shared yet. So I'm a little bit nervous about it. It happens. But I think it's important. I called them thought vibrations. And so I will be sharing 10 new paintings that live with this idea of a thought vibration that were created during the 2020-2021 year. And essentially, I see these thoughts as filling the air that surrounds the paintings as they're being created. And they behave like prompts in a way. They were invented slowly, and some went through many versions. And at times, I would just listen and hear the words, and quickly write them down before I forgot. I could be eating breakfast, watching a movie, staring out of the window, or even cleaning my paintbrushes. Each phrase began with the first letter, and each one of the 10 letters in that word that you see on the screen right now, palimpsest. Ultimately, the titles of the paintings, corresponded with the first word of each phrase. And I just want to say that it really all began with the letter I. And that phrase was, I am not invisible. So it was a pretty powerful way to begin a painting project. And so, of course, I'm delighted to be able to share it with you today. And let's see, what else? Okay, so let me just go back to something. A palimpsest is a document whose former text has been erased to make space for a new text, right? I mean, as a process in the studio, I began with small drawings on Yupo paper that were like 9 by 12 inches. And from there, I had the drawings photographed, enlarged, and laser printed on gessoed canvas that ultimately became 60 by 80 inch paintings. I did not erase the paintings or the subject, but instead I built on top of it. I kept adding onto it. So everything that was in the initial drawing was there, and then I just it became like the first layer. And so that the palimpsest in the studio, this idea of the palimpsest in the studio, allowed for this opportunity to juxtapose scale, shape, and color. The drawings were photographed, then printed with a laser color printer, fusing them onto the canvas, and then those were stretched onto aluminum frames, and so the paint so I could start painting on them, basically. I was very interested in this idea of intimacy and scale, and also in many ways, how do I begin to continue this idea of destroying this idea of hierarchies in painting and drawing and printmaking? You know, this, how do you begin to sort of let that all go? And because it's something that's existed with mediums for a long time, although that's almost all, it's disappearing on some levels. So facing one's drawing gesture, or as I face my own, like a signature, using cursive, which we know is not really being taught in schools anymore. You know, it's like surprising and mysterious and magical all at once. So all the steps are recorded on the surfaces of these paintings that you're about to see. But the thought waves, which I've never really talked about, are like videos of the process. To me, they're cinematic, they're still, they're chatty, they're silent. So basically, I want to show you this in silence because that's how I really work. And I want you to allow yourself the opportunity to record your questions, your reflections as you watch it. And feel free to share it at the end of this. There's no pressure to do either one. But I just think it's really, it's just, you know, after a day like this, where there's been so much talking and you're hearing so many wonderful ideas, you know, how do we begin to take them in, right? So I just want to give you this opportunity as a part of closing, which is really a beginning, right? It's another beginning point, to sort of have these thoughts fester, perhaps as you see this, the way my ideas come together, right? It's not just this quote unquote abstract painting, but there's a lot of context in my work, and it's a lot of it's kind of mysterious, and I really go for what surprises me. And so I wanted to share this today. And these are new, very new works. And they're up now in the gallery in LA, Gablac. If you want to see the website, you're more than happy to. But let's go on. So let's start, Susana. Can you turn the page? Okay. It was hard being silent, I have to say. I'm not used to it, but I think that there's something about speaking words, right? And also listening versus reading words, and the vibration of that. And it's always curious what words linger, right? Through generations, like what words are always said. And I think after teaching for so many years, I find myself I'm starting to listen to myself more now, right? And I think during COVID and virtual teaching, something happened, right? Because this Zoom experience just, it's not natural for me. And it always feels a little disruptive, you know, the sort of flow that happens when I'm one-to-one with a person. So, but I wanted to try this out and see how it kind of works for all of you in the room. I can't see all of you in the room. I see a lot of names, but I'm just hoping that you'll have some questions. And Susanna, if you have a question or two or three to start to kind of break the ice, let's go for it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Candida. And already you're getting comments. Brava, Candida from Monique Meloche. So beautiful. Thanks, Candida from Rodrigo. And Helen K writes, your thought vibrations made me cry. So powerful. So, and I want to, as Candida said, we welcome questions for the artist at this point. So if you want to drop them into the Q&A or the chat, I'll be passing them along. But Candida, I think maybe as Helen noted, there is a lot of emotion. And I think that's something that we were talking about earlier as well in the previous panel about, as an artist, as a curator, I mean, as a person wanting to present yourself as a professional, as an intellectual, perhaps, and at times negotiating some of who we are as a person, our backgrounds. And I'm wondering if you want to pick up on that. I think, as you were saying, you are putting yourself first. I didn't know, you hadn't shared with me previously that I was the word or the letter that you started with first. I think you certainly should be foregrounding your I, and maybe you can start the conversation there.
Oh gosh. It's a curious thing to begin to talk about what a painting is, right? If it's not representational, right? This idea that we have to keep, even with painting itself, like there are these hierarchies, right? This representation, this figuration, I don't believe in all of it. I just believe a good painting has all of it, right? And so I'm always fighting against a lot of these things. And when I teach, it gives me a platform to feel more whole in my thinking, right? So, and so I don't know if I'm going to be able to go right to where you were asking, because it was such a big question, but I just want to say the things that stand out for me, even for the short time that I've been on the air, listening, it's this idea that Stuart Hall came up in the last panel about 3 times. And that made me happy in a way, but I was really kind of fascinated by that, right? And I remember meeting him in London in the 80s.
I remember you sharing this story during our supper club conversation.
I remember, and he wrote this fantastic essay called Minimal Selves after I met him, which for me was one of the most important essays, about it was all about being postmodern, right? And like feeling like he was himself, like he really understood himself through that, right? Through that, even that naming, right? And it was really, I mean, he was, it was 80s, and they were using the word Black there. Like it was, everybody felt very comfortable with it, right? I mean, it was anybody who was non-white, right? And it was like sort of like surprising to us coming from the States, to be in the midst of all that comfort, right? And so I'll never forget that. He looked just like he could be my grandfather, You know, he looked just, you know what I mean? Like I had that feeling for him. And I think there is something to the, you know, you could read somebody's work and you could also know that person, right? But you could also know that person and then read their work and something happens, right? You can listen, you listen very differently. And so for me, to have this life where I've met all these incredible people, right? When you meet them, you don't know what your life is really going to look like. But it's just a nice thing to know that, you know, we're sort of all, we're sort of in it. We come from different places, but we meet at these centers, right? We meet at these places. And I think that's why, you know, teaching and learning and being in shows, you know, having opportunities to intermix, like, I think the more we can intermix through generations, the healthier it is, right? The fact that there was a lot of young people in that exhibition, I did not know before, but then there were others that I did know because, you know, I had a hand in teaching them, right? It was such a beautiful thing for me and for your invitation to come and be in the middle of this. And I'm like, what? You know, because for the most part, you do your work, you never know what that means. You don't know who's being affected by it unless, you know, when you start to show and people start to write about it, then you feel like, oh, maybe I am doing something, you know, that people are actually connecting to, right? But for a long time, most of us, we work quietly, silently, for the most part, right? Once you leave school, what do, right? Or if you never go to school because you're one of those artists who learned it a different way, but creativity lives. It lives in so many different ways. We could name it whatever we want to name it, but still, you know, there is something about the discovery of it, the magic of it, the mystery of it. And for me, it's all about my freedom. You know, when I'm in my studio, that's my freedom. I do whatever the hell I want to do. And I can call it whatever I want to or not call it anything at all, but painting, period. Right. And I think that we do need to go through these cycles where we rename ourselves. Right. And you live long enough, you've seen a lot of them and you've heard a lot of them. You know, that crazy, awful word, Hispanic, that I had to listen to, you know, in the 80s, 90s. Right. You know what I mean? Like, who's panic? Hispanic? No, it's not my panic. Right. It was just so upsetting to me. You know, and then it's like, you know, so we have to assert ourselves. It just has to happen. It's the cycle of life, you know. We have to, you know, it's like we listen to different music, right? But then there's music that ties us all together, you know. Most people I know, either young or old, kind of like jazz, and some of them really hate it too, right? I mean, I shouldn't even say that because it's just like what connects us? What can connect us? You know, we share airspace. We all know that we're being very affected by this airspace that we have to breathe, you know, and I think COVID did something, you know, where it really leveled the sort of that feel, you know, we could all die. We can die today or tomorrow, right? We didn't know how this invisible thing was going to affect us. And I think we had to all live in a kind of solitude, right? We had to kind of like protect ourselves. I mean, for most of us who paid attention. And so I think that, you know, the fact that I'm in Michigan, the fact that I'm painting around nature, I never thought I'd do that, you know, but there's something quite wonderful about experiencing nature and its insistence on survival, right? It insists, it persists, no matter what you do to it, it will continue. And I think there are a lot of lessons here, right? A lot of lessons for me. And I've been teaching for a long time and I need to relearn things too, right? So it's kind of nice to be on the other side of things, right? So I don't know, it was just so great to be in the midst of all of this, you know, and to watch you, I mean, to have this group exhibition, which was, you know, which was a total collaboration, right? Between you, Rodrigo, I'm sure that was really hard. It's not an easy thing to do it by yourself, but it's not easy to do it with you know, more than, you know, with a few people, but it must have been so exciting too, because at some point you agreed, you saw something, right? And you all learned something. And it was very beautiful to hear you talk about it, you know, when we had our conversation. So I have to say kudos to the work you've done. I'm so delighted that Museo it feels alive again, you know, it's gotten, it's just growing again, I mean, and I think that, we really wanted something for Puerto Rico, right? When it was first started, right? There was this fire, we wanted something for Puerto Rico, but, to maintain that, right? To maintain that idea was very difficult. If we just make it so singular, right? It just doesn't always work. And we have to think more globally and more, more with a breath, that, there is power in numbers. There is power in numbers, but I don't want to riff off too much, but I feel like there are all these tangents.
I'm just letting you talk, Candida.
But me, I can talk.
Well, I think it relates to that palimpsest, like you said, it's the building of experience.
Yes, and that's why I found it to be a word for me at this moment in time. And that's what I find happens to me. Like there are things that come to me that I have to linger with. And because I am, I mean, I do paint these paintings that look abstract, because why? Because you can't name it, right? Because you can't say, I see a leg, but I see all of those things because there are all those things in it, right? So, but there's these actions that create reactions. Color is so wonderful. I mean, how can you live without color? So for me, it is my chemistry. It is how I build. It's how I narrate. It's how I live. It's how I taste, right? It's how I smell, everything. It's all very natural. And so for me, right, to have this vessel in which to pour into all these, to kind of pour into create a content, for something that supposedly has no context or no importance to, unless you can name it, you feel like you can't get it. And so if you can't get it, then that means you don't believe in it. If you don't believe in it, then it doesn't mean anything to you, right? So, but instead of just thinking, well, maybe there's something more here, like, maybe it's just about me allowing myself the pleasure of standing in front of this painting for a few minutes to kind of absorb the kind of response that color can give you. Color can make you happy, and it can make you really sad too, right?
Well, we should say, I should share the experience of working with you on this PowerPoint, and your maybe you can also explain your very insistent desire to have this watermelon pink and green as part of this conversation.
Yes. Well, I was eating watermelon. I couldn't have enough of it. All of a sudden it was just like, oh my gosh, it tastes so good. And then learning, you learn how to find the right watermelon, right? You hit it, and if it's hollow, you look for that yellow watermark. I'm fascinated by it, and they're beautiful. And that's why I said, this is the end of a long day of a lot of very serious and also, a lot of things to think about and to arm yourself with, right? Because we have to protect ourselves as we love ourselves, as we care for each other, as we grow in community, as we allow the freedoms to live the way we want to live, and to stop thinking that we have to fill boxes. Freedom comes in shaping your own box or whatever it is that makes you comfortable, and it's the power of that, to say, yes, I want this, right? And you can't, and if you can't afford it, then you make it, or you create something else, right? There's always paper lying around. I tell this to my students all the time who don't, who come to take classes, and they don't have a lot of money, and so it's like, well, then what do? Then you have to come up with a way to make it work, right? That's creativity, right? And so you have to believe, and you have to take a risk. You certainly have to have courage in this life, because nothing just, right? So, but tell me, so you would say, so yes, this PowerPoint, I wanted it to be bright because I wanted it to be unexpected, because I wanted to keep everybody awake, and I wanted them to pay attention, and I wanted to take a chance. This is a chance for me, because I've never done a presentation like this before. right? And so I wanted to share these crazy thought waves, and also not crazy. There were things that I needed to hear for myself. Like
Well,
this.
I wanted to ask you precisely that. So you said that you needed the thought waves, you needed to hear them yourself, but do you also see them as directives to us as your audience? Do they guide your paintings? Is this shared knowledge?
I don't see, I wouldn't say directives. Word makes me a little uncomfortable, but I would say that if they can, an old word is inspire, right? Some people don't want to use the word inspire, but you know, if they can give you something to hold on to, you know, if they can change your day, if one of those words can change, or one of those phrases can change your day, then, you know, something beautiful has happened. You're not going to see those words in the paintings. You're going to hopefully sense something in the paintings that is completely different. But maybe it makes you feel alive. Maybe it brings you to a memory, right? Because color can do that. And I watched my father talk about this, and he never had training. You know, he'd go in front of my painting and just go on and on and on and on and tell stories. So I think whatever it is, allow it to happen. There's no right or wrong to how meaning gets made when one is in front of a painting, for example, right? You know, you have to learn to unlearn information, right? Because we have to trust our creative senses. And so I want people, I wanted to share this because I wanted my community here that is here with us to understand that there's a lot that goes into my work, right? And it's not always visible. Mm-hmm. And I was hearing some of these, like sometimes the phrases would just come. I don't know why does that happen? But it's like when, you know, it's like sooner or later, you know, when you teach, as long as I've been teaching 25 years, you start to understand yourself really well, right? You understand what the priorities are. You know, let it go, be yourself, you know, trust yourself. I don't know how many times I've said that, you know, have courage to be yourself. You know, I don't expect to see it's not about what I expect to see. It's about what you're willing to give. Right. Yeah. So I think these are learned. These are things that I had to share today, you know, and they might pop up again. They will be in a book form. They will be published shortly. But also, I didn't say that I got to this. This is how I started in actually painting in my studio after moving here, and 5 truckloads later. You know, it was very traumatic. You know, when you move, it's like, oh my gosh, you have to, I mean, you just forget what you have until you have to load it out of your house into another house. But the pleasure of having a new place to work in, right? Despite all the challenges of moving, I had to begin somewhere. I had to give myself the courage to begin, you know, because I had a show coming up. I had to work. So how does that happen? I don't just snap my finger. I'm not that kind of artist who just sits there and, you know, just starts.
Candida, you gave us the place to begin with Estoy Bien. And actually, we're returning to that phrase at the close, at the end. So I know our time is short. I don't know if you want to just tell us briefly about your closing slide as our way of sending our audiences off.
Yes. I wish you all happiness, you know, and I really want, and I mean true happiness, right? Whatever that form takes. And, you know, to say, I will see you soon, you know, te veo pronto, as opposed to saying goodbye, means that we can cycle around each other again. You know, that's what life is, right? We cycle, we recycle, you know, we go through like a palimpsest, you know, you can cover it up if you want to, you can erase it, but then there's always that thing waiting for you to activate, right? It's whatever it is for you. But make your choices, you know that you have choices, despite the fact that there is a lot of, you know, negativity in the world, right? But community really is it's a way to remember that you're not by yourself. And because sometimes we feel, you know, when you feel the worst, it's over, you know, but you forget all the love that could be surrounding you, right? Pero sí, estoy bien. I just want it because you know, it's those words, it's a vibration, right? That that folks during some of the hardest times, moments, you know, they say out loud. It's almost like a prayer, right? They want to believe they're well, even though it's crisis mode, right? COVID put us all in a crisis mode, right? I mean, but a lot of us survived and did well, right? A lot of good things happened despite all the pain and the confusion, right? And I'm just grateful. I'm grateful to be here right now, to kind of hear the words, you know, the stories being shared. To see Museo come alive again, you know, and I will see you all again, I think, in many different ways, right? And I just say, you know, just trust yourselves, push yourselves, and do the work that you really want to do. And te veo pronto.
Well, Candida, thank you for those closing remarks. And as you said, I love that this is a beginning. It's the beginning for the inaugural La TRIENAL, so the beginning of a new series, the beginning of new relationships among ourselves, as you mentioned. And on the note of community, I really want to thank everyone for being here today, for participating in the conference. Thank you to all of our panelists and speakers, Candida, Nugent, Vic, Ariana, Vivian, Marcella, Elizabeth, Julie, Cecilia, and of course my co-curators, Elia Alba and Rodrigo Mota. And I also want to give a really special thanks to all of my colleagues at El Museo, especially everyone on the public programs and AV teams, Mark Manalfi, Christian Martir, Clara Diaz, and Elena, I'm blanking out on your last name, but I know you'll forgive me. So thank you all for making today's event happen. And please come visit Estamos Bien. You have 2 more days to come to El Museo. We're open 11 to 5 p.m. tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday, September 26th is very sadly the final day, but you can still make it here. So thank you everyone so much, and te veo pronto. I'll steal from you, Candida. Thank you all.
Thank you.